Welcome, young wizard, to a tale of power, politics, and the endless complexities of magical governance. Tonight, we journey through the complete history of the Ministry of Magic, from its humble beginnings in medieval chambers to the grand institution that governs the wizarding world today. As you settle into your cozy reading nook, let these words carry you through centuries of political intrigue, bureaucratic evolution, and the eternal struggle between tradition and progress. Close your eyes and drift into this chronicle of magical administration, where every decree shaped destiny and every minister left their mark on wizarding history. In the mist-shrouded valleys of medieval Britain, where ancient magic flowed as freely as the rivers that carved their paths through moorland and forest, there existed a time when wizarding governance was as fragmented as broken glass scattered across a castle floor. Long before the grand atrium of the Ministry of Magic welcomed daily streams of witches and wizards conducting their bureaucratic business, magical folk organized themselves through a patchwork of local councils, regional authorities, and clan-based hierarchies that reflected the feudal structures of the Muggle world around them. The earliest attempts at wizarding governance emerged naturally from necessity, born in village squares where traveling wizards would gather to share news and settle disputes. In castle towers where noble wizarding families held court over their magical tenants, and in forest clearings where druids and wise women administered rough justice according to laws older than memory itself. These primitive assemblies bore little resemblance to the sophisticated governmental apparatus that would eventually rise in London's depths, but they carried within them the seeds of all future magical administration. During the tumultuous 13th century, when Muggle barons warred with their king and common folk struggled to survive in a world of constant conflict, magical communities faced their own unique challenges that no earthly authority could comprehend or address. A young wizard's accidental magic might set fire to an entire village, requiring swift action to modify memories and rebuild homes without attracting unwanted attention. A witch's failed love potion could drive half a town mad with uncontrollable passion, demanding immediate intervention from those who understood the complexities of magical remedies. Dark wizards, emboldened by the chaos of civil wars, would establish their own territories where they practiced forbidden arts and terrorized both magical and non-magical populations with equal cruelty. It was from this crucible of necessity that the first organized magical authority began to emerge. The Wizards' Council, as it would come to be known, grew from informal gatherings of the most respected magical practitioners in each region, men and women whose wisdom and power made them natural leaders in times of crisis. Unlike the hereditary nobility that ruled the Muggle world, these early magical leaders achieved their positions through demonstrated competence in the magical arts. Though family connections and inherited wealth certainly played their part in determining who received the education necessary to develop such competence, the formation of the Wizards' Council in the early 14th century represented a revolutionary step forward in magical governance, creating for the first time a centralized authority that could speak for all of magical Britain. The Council's founding charter, written on parchment made from dragon hide and sealed with phoenix wax, established principles that would influence magical law for centuries to come. Magic, the charter declared, was both gift and responsibility, carrying with it obligations to protect the innocent and maintain the delicate balance between the magical and mundane worlds. The Council's early structure reflected the diverse nature of magical society, with representatives chosen from various magical disciplines and geographical regions. Master alchemists sat beside accomplished healers. Powerful transfigurationists debated with gifted seers, and ancient families that could trace their magical lineage back to the founders of Hogwarts shared council chambers with newer families whose magical talents had emerged from Muggle stock. This diversity of perspective and expertise proved to be both the Council's greatest strength and its most persistent source of internal conflict. Regional variations in magical practice created endless complications for the new central authority. What passed for acceptable magic in the wild Scottish Highlands might be considered dangerously irresponsible in the crowded streets of medieval London. The ancient magical traditions of Wales, steeped in Celtic mysticism and nature worship, often clashed with the more formal, scholarly approach favoured by wizards educated at Hogwarts. Irish magical practitioners brought their own unique perspectives, influenced by centuries of conflict with Viking raiders and Norman invaders who had learned to fear and persecute anything they couldn't understand. The influence of ancient wizarding families on early political structures cannot be overstated. Names that would later appear on the Sacred 28's controversial list of pureblood families were already establishing themselves as pillars of magical society during this formative period. The Blacks, the Malfoys, the Lestrangers, and dozens of other families used their accumulated wealth, extensive magical libraries, and carefully cultivated political connections to shape the development of magical law in ways that would benefit their interests for generations to come. These established families understood that true power lay not in dramatic displays of magical might, but in the careful accumulation of influence over time. They funded the construction of the Council's first permanent meeting halls, donated rare magical texts to establish the first official magical archives, and provided the gold necessary to maintain a growing bureaucracy. In exchange, they expected and received significant input into the policies that governed magical society, creating precedents for family influence that would persist well into the modern era. The development of formal magical law during the Council era represented a monumental undertaking that required reconciling hundreds of years of local customs, traditional practices, and regional variations into a coherent legal framework. The Council's first comprehensive legal code, known as the Magna Carta Magica, attempted to establish universal standards for magical conduct while respecting the diversity of magical traditions throughout the British Isles. The document ran to over 300 pages of closely written text, covering everything from the proper disposal of failed potion ingredients to the protocols for resolving disputes between wizarding neighbours. Enforcement of these new laws proved to be an even greater challenge than their creation. The Council established the first organised magical law enforcement service, initially called the Warlock's Watch, which would eventually evolve into the Auror Office. These early magical law officers faced dangers that their Muggle counterparts couldn't imagine. Dark wizards who could kill with a word, criminals who could disappear into thin air at will, and magical creatures whose very presence could drive men mad with terror. The Warlock's Watch developed innovative techniques for magical law enforcement that combined traditional investigative methods with uniquely magical approaches. Memory extraction became a standard tool for gathering evidence, though its use was carefully regulated to prevent abuse. Tracking spells allowed officers to follow criminals across vast distances, while protective charms provided defense against the most dangerous dark arts. The Watch also pioneered the use of magical restraints and transportation methods, creating the first versions of techniques that modern aurors would recognize and employ. International relations during the Council era were complicated by the lack of similar governmental structures in most other magical communities around the world. While some European countries had developed their own versions of magical councils, many regions still operated under traditional tribal or clan-based systems that made formal diplomacy nearly impossible. The British Wizards' Council found itself in the unique position of being one of the most advanced magical governments in the world, a status that brought both prestige and responsibility. Early diplomatic contact with magical governments in France, Germany, and Italy led to the establishment of the first international magical treaties. These agreements primarily focused on extradition of magical criminals, regulation of cross-border trade in magical materials, and coordination of responses to major magical disasters that might affect multiple countries. The Council also began the practice of exchanging magical knowledge with foreign institutions, leading to advances in magical theory and practice that benefited wizards throughout Europe. The growing tension between the magical and Muggle worlds that would eventually lead to the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy began to manifest clearly during the later Council period. As the medieval era gave way to the Renaissance, Muggle society became increasingly sophisticated and organized, making it more difficult to explain away magical incidents as natural phenomena or divine intervention. The rise of scientific thinking, while still in its infancy, began to provide alternative explanations for events that had previously been attributed to magic or miracles. Witch trials, while never as common in Britain as in some continental countries, represented a growing threat to magical communities. The Council found itself spending increasing amounts of time and resources on protecting magical folk from Muggle persecution, developing elaborate systems of false identities, memory modification, and relocation that would become standard practice in later centuries. The psychological toll of living in constant fear of discovery began to wear on magical communities, leading to heated debates about whether the time had come to withdraw from the Muggle world entirely. The Council's response to these pressures was typically measured and conservative. Rather than advocating for immediate separation from Muggle society, they chose to strengthen the existing systems of concealment while working to reduce magical accidents and incidents that might attract unwanted attention. New regulations required wizards to obtain licenses for potentially dangerous magic, restricted the use of spells in Muggle-inhabited areas, and established severe penalties for magical exposure incidents. These preparatory measures for what would eventually become the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy demonstrated the Council's understanding that major changes were inevitable. The old system of informal coexistence between magical and non-magical communities was breaking down under the pressure of social, technological, and religious changes in the broader world. The question was not whether change would come, but whether the magical community would shape that change proactively or be forced to react to circumstances beyond their control. The Council's greatest achievement during this period may have been its success in maintaining unity within the magical community, despite growing external pressures and internal disagreements about the proper response to changing circumstances. The temptation to fragment along regional, cultural, or ideological lines was considerable, particularly as different magical communities faced varying levels of threat from Muggle authorities and social changes. The Council's insistence on collective decision-making and shared responsibility helped ensure that British magical society would meet the coming challenges as a unified entity rather than a collection of competing factions. By the late 17th century, as reports of massive witch trials and systematic persecution of magical folk arrived from other parts of Europe, the limitations of the Council system had become increasingly apparent. The informal, consensus-based approach that had served adequately during quieter times proved inadequate for the rapid decision-making and coordinated action that crisis management required. The Council's deliberative processes, designed to ensure that all voices were heard and all perspectives considered, became liabilities when swift action was needed to protect magical communities under immediate threat. The stage was set for the revolutionary changes that would sweep through the magical world in the closing years of the 17th century. The ancient Wizards' Council, which had served the British magical community for over 3 centuries, was about to face challenges that would test every assumption about magical governance and ultimately lead to its replacement by an entirely new form of magical administration. The Ministry of Magic that would emerge from this transformation would bear the influence of the Council's legacy while representing a fundamental departure from the old ways of organizing magical society. In castle libraries where flickering candlelight illuminated ancient texts on magical lore, in tavern back rooms where council members debated policy over glasses of butterbeer, and in the hearts of ordinary wizarding folk who looked to their leaders for protection and guidance, the foundations of modern magical government were taking shape. The story of that transformation, and the institution that arose from it, would prove to be one of the most significant developments in the long history of magical Britain. The closing years of the 17th century witnessed one of the most profound transformations in the history of magical governance, as the ancient systems that had served wizarding communities for centuries gave way to revolutionary new approaches to magical administration. The catalyst for this monumental change was not internal reform or gradual evolution, but external pressure of such magnitude that it threatened the very existence of magical society as a cohesive entity. Across Europe, the persecution of witches and wizards had reached unprecedented levels of systematic brutality. In Germany, entire villages suspected of harboring magical folk were put to the torch. French authorities, emboldened by royal proclamations against sorcery, conducted house-to-house searches that forced hundreds of magical families into desperate flight. The Spanish Inquisition had developed terrifyingly effective methods for detecting magical ability, leading to mass executions that decimated the Iberian magical community. Even in traditionally tolerant regions, the political and religious upheavals of the age created environments where magical folk became convenient scapegoats for every natural disaster, failed harvest, or unexplained death. The British magical community, while somewhat protected by the island's geographic isolation and the relatively decentralized nature of English persecution efforts, could not remain immune to these broader trends. Reports reached the Wizards' Council of English witches and wizards fleeing to the New World, of ancient magical families abandoning ancestral homes under cover of darkness, of children born with magical gifts being hidden away by terrified parents who understood that discovery meant death. The old arrangements that had allowed magical and non-magical communities to coexist, however uneasily, were collapsing under the weight of fear, suspicion, and systematic violence. It was against this backdrop of crisis that magical leaders from around the world began to contemplate solutions that would have seemed unthinkable just decades earlier. The International Confederation of Wizards, a loose association of magical authorities that had previously concerned itself primarily with regulating international Quidditch matches and standardizing potion ingredients, found itself thrust into the role of coordinator for what amounted to a species-wide survival strategy. The initial proposal for what would become the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy came not from Britain but from a group of French magical scholars who had witnessed firsthand the devastation wrought by the witch trials in their homeland. Their radical suggestion was nothing less than the complete separation of magical and non-magical societies, a permanent withdrawal from the Muggle world that would ensure the safety of magical communities while allowing them to develop their unique culture and capabilities without interference or persecution. The proposal sent shockwaves through magical communities worldwide. For centuries, wizarding society had been intertwined with the non-magical world in countless ways. Magical folk had served as healers in Muggle communities, had married into non-magical families, had drawn inspiration and knowledge from Muggle innovations in art, literature, and natural philosophy. The idea of severing these connections entirely seemed to many like cultural suicide, a retreat into isolation that would ultimately weaken magical society by cutting it off from the broader stream of human development. The debates that raged in magical assemblies across Europe during the 1680s and 90s were among the most passionate and divisive in magical history. Progressive voices argued that separation was cowardice, that magical folk had a responsibility to use their gifts for the betterment of all humanity, That withdrawal would only confirm Muggle suspicions about the dark and dangerous nature of magical power. Conservative factions countered that integration had become impossible, that Muggle fear and hatred had reached such levels that peaceful coexistence was no longer achievable, that the primary duty of magical leaders was to protect their own people rather than pursue idealistic dreams of cooperation. The British Wizards' Council found itself deeply divided on the question. The ancient families that dominated the Council's leadership were generally supportive of separation, seeing it as an opportunity to preserve traditional wizarding culture from what they viewed as corrupting Muggle influences. Many of these families had already begun the process of withdrawing from Muggle society, consolidating their holdings in remote magical settlements, and severing business relationships that had persisted for generations. For them, formal separation would merely acknowledge a reality that was already taking shape. Younger council members, particularly those from families with recent Muggle ancestry, were far more skeptical of the separation proposal. They pointed out that magical society had always drawn strength from its diversity, that some of the most innovative magical discoveries had come from wizards and witches who moved freely between magical and non-magical worlds, that isolation might lead to stagnation and decline rather than preservation and growth. They also raised practical concerns about the feasibility of complete separation, questioning whether it would be possible to maintain the complex systems of trade, communication, and cultural exchange that had developed over centuries. The turning point in British opinion came with a series of incidents during the winter of 1691 to 1692 that demonstrated the inadequacy of existing concealment methods. A young wizard's attempt to help Muggle farmers during a harsh winter by magically melting snow from their fields was witnessed by dozens of people and led to accusations of demonic intervention. A witch healer's successful treatment of a plague outbreak was attributed to satanic bargains, resulting in her capture and execution before magical authorities could intervene. Most devastatingly, a group of Hogwarts students on a field expedition were discovered practicing magic by Muggle authorities, leading to a manhunt that nearly exposed the existence of the school itself. These incidents convinced even skeptical council members that the old system of informal concealment was breaking down. The increasing literacy and communication networks in Muggle society meant that magical incidents could no longer be dismissed as isolated superstitions or local legends. News traveled faster and farther than ever before, making it impossible to contain exposure incidents within small geographic areas. The scientific revolution, while still in its early stages, was encouraging Muggles to seek rational explanations for unusual phenomena, making them more likely to investigate rather than simply accept magical events as divine mysteries. The Council's decision to support the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy was reached only after months of agonizing deliberation and intense political maneuvering. The final vote was closer than many historians later acknowledged, with traditional allies finding themselves on opposite sides of the question and regional representatives facing enormous pressure from their constituents. The deciding factor may have been a series of private meetings between council leadership and representatives from magical communities on the continent, who provided graphic testimony about the consequences of failing to act decisively. When the International Confederation of Wizards convened in 1692 to formally adopt the statute, the British delegation played a crucial role in shaping the document's final form. British magical lawyers, drawing on centuries of experience in navigating the complex relationships between royal, ecclesiastical, and common law, helped craft language that balanced the need for absolute secrecy with recognition of the practical challenges that implementation would entail. The statute's famous first clause, requiring magical folk to conceal their abilities from non-magical populations, by all means necessary and expedient, reflected British legal traditions that emphasized practical effectiveness over theoretical purity. The implementation of the statute represented perhaps the greatest logistical undertaking in the history of magic. Every magical community in the world would need to be identified, contacted, and provided with new systems for maintaining secrecy. Thousands of Muggle witnesses to magical events would require memory modification on a scale never before attempted. Magical locations that had operated openly for centuries would need to be concealed or relocated entirely. Trade relationships, marriages, and cultural connections that had developed over generations would need to be severed or transformed beyond recognition. The British magical community's response to these challenges demonstrated both remarkable innovation and deep-seated resistance to change. The memory modification efforts, led by teams of specially trained wizards working around the clock, succeeded in erasing magical knowledge from hundreds of thousands of Muggle minds. Ancient magical settlements like Diagon Alley were concealed behind elaborate concealment charms that made them invisible to non-magical eyes. New systems for magical transportation, communication, and commerce were developed to replace connections with the Muggle world that could no longer be maintained. Yet, even as these massive efforts proceeded, it became increasingly clear that the old Wizards' Council was ill-equipped to manage such a comprehensive transformation of magical society. The Council's consensus-based decision-making process, which had served adequately during more stable times, proved hopelessly slow when rapid responses were needed to implementation crises. Regional representatives, focused primarily on the concerns of their immediate constituents, struggled to coordinate their efforts with colleagues from other areas facing different challenges and priorities. The Council's informal administrative structure, which had relied heavily on volunteer efforts and personal relationships between members, began to break down under the weight of new responsibilities. The statute's implementation required permanent bureaucratic apparatus, professional administrators, and specialized departments that the Council had never needed to develop. Tasks that had previously been handled by part-time volunteers now demanded full-time attention from experts in fields ranging from memory modification to international magical law. Recognition of these systemic inadequacies led to increasingly urgent calls for fundamental governmental reform. The most vocal advocates for change were younger council members who had been educated at Hogwarts during a period of rapid expansion in magical knowledge and administrative sophistication. They pointed to the success of magical institutions like Gringotts Bank and St. T. Mungo's Hospital, which had developed efficient bureaucratic structures for managing complex operations, as models for what magical government might become. The proposal to replace the Wizards' Council with an entirely new form of magical government gained momentum throughout the early years of statute implementation. Supporters argued that the crisis had demonstrated the need for professional administration, clear lines of authority, and specialized expertise that the old system could never provide. They envisioned a Ministry of Magic that would combine the democratic representation that had been the Council's strength with the administrative efficiency that modern magical society required. Opposition to the ministry proposal came primarily from traditional council families who feared losing the influence they had accumulated over centuries of participation in magical governance. They argued that bureaucratic government would become distant and unresponsive to local needs, that professional administrators would lack the deep understanding of magical culture that came from family traditions spanning generations, that centralized authority would stifle the regional diversity that had always been a source of magical Britain's strength. The debate over governmental reform became entangled with broader questions about the direction of post-statute magical society. Progressives saw the ministry as an opportunity to create a more egalitarian magical world, where talent and merit would matter more than family connections and inherited wealth. Conservatives viewed it as a dangerous experiment that would undermine the traditional structures that had preserved magical culture through centuries of external threat and internal challenge. The resolution of this constitutional crisis came through a series of compromises that reflected the pragmatic traditions of British magical politics. The new ministry would indeed replace the Wizards' Council as the primary governmental authority, but it would incorporate many of the Council's traditional practices and principles. Regional representation would be maintained through a complex system that balanced population with geographic and cultural considerations. The ancient magical families would retain significant influence through their control of key institutions like Gringotts and their relationships with international magical organizations. The formal establishment of the Ministry of Magic in 1707 marked the end of one era and the beginning of another in magical governance. The ceremony itself reflected the tension between old and new that characterized the transition. Traditional elements included the blessing of the new institution by representatives of all 4 Hogwarts houses, the presentation of ancient artifacts symbolizing the continuity of magical authority, and speeches delivered in archaic ceremonial language that connected the ministry to centuries of magical tradition. Modern innovations were equally prominent in the establishment ceremonies. The new minister was chosen through a formal selection process that included written examinations, practical demonstrations of administrative competence, and public presentations of policy proposals. The ministry's organizational structure was announced with detailed descriptions of departmental responsibilities, reporting relationships, and accountability mechanisms that would have seemed impossibly complex to earlier generations of magical leaders. Ulick Gamp's appointment as the first Minister of Magic represented both continuity and change in magical leadership. A member of an ancient pure-blood family with impeccable council credentials, Gamp nonetheless had spent his career advocating for administrative reform and modernization. His selection satisfied traditionalists who valued family connections and personal relationships while reassuring progressives that the new ministry would indeed represent a departure from old ways of conducting magical business. Gamp's early policies reflected the delicate balancing act required to establish the ministry's authority while maintaining the support of diverse constituencies within magical society. His first major initiative was the creation of 5 core departments that would handle the most essential functions of magical government. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement would absorb and expand upon the old Warlock's Watch, providing professional law enforcement services throughout magical Britain. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes would coordinate responses to the magical emergencies that seemed to be increasing in frequency and severity as magical society adjusted to its new isolation. The Department of International Magical Cooperation reflected the reality that magical Britain could not remain completely isolated from magical communities elsewhere in the world. The statute had severed connections with the Muggle world, but it had actually increased the importance of relationships with magical governments and institutions in other countries. The new department would manage everything from diplomatic relations with foreign magical governments to coordination of international magical research and development efforts. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures acknowledged the complex relationships between wizards and the various non-human magical beings that shared the hidden magical world. The statute's implementation had affected these creatures in different ways, with some benefiting from increased isolation from potentially hostile Muggle populations, while others found their traditional territories and relationships disrupted by the new concealment requirements. The Department of Mysteries was perhaps the most innovative aspect of the new ministry's structure, reflecting recognition that magical society would need to develop new knowledge and capabilities to thrive in its post-statute isolation. The department would conduct research into fundamental questions of magical theory and practice, investigate phenomena that threatened magical security, and develop new techniques for maintaining the statute's requirements while advancing magical knowledge and capability. The process of staffing these new departments proved to be as challenging as defining their responsibilities. The ministry needed to recruit hundreds of employees with skills and expertise that had never been required by the old council system. Professional administrators, legal specialists, researchers, and support staff had to be found, trained, and integrated into a governmental structure that existed nowhere else in the magical world. Many of the ministry's first employees were drawn from existing magical institutions that had developed sophisticated administrative practices. Gringotts Bank provided experts in magical finance and security. St. Mungo's Hospital contributed specialists in magical healing and emergency response. Hogwarts School supplied educators and researchers who understood the complexities of magical knowledge and its practical applications. Private magical businesses offered administrators and managers who understood the challenges of organizing complex operations. The recruitment process also revealed the social tensions within magical Britain that the statute's implementation had created or exacerbated. Traditional pureblood families expected their members to receive preferential consideration for senior positions, based on their historical contributions to magical governance and their deep understanding of magical culture. Families with recent Muggle ancestry argued that merit and qualifications should be the primary criteria for employment, pointing out that the ministry's success would depend on attracting the most capable individuals regardless of their background. The compromise that emerged from these competing pressures established patterns of ministry employment that would persist for centuries. Senior positions were often filled by members of established magical families who possessed both the necessary qualifications and the political connections required to navigate the complex relationships between different governmental departments. Junior positions were more likely to be awarded based primarily on merit and examination results, creating opportunities for talented individuals from less prominent families to enter magical government service. The ministry's relationship with the Muggle world during its early years was defined by the overriding imperative to maintain the statute while managing the practical necessities of coexistence. The new Department of Muggle Relations, though not officially established until several years later, began as an informal network of ministry employees who specialized in the delicate work of managing magical Muggle interactions without violating the statute's secrecy requirements. Memory modification became one of the ministry's most important and controversial activities during this period. Teams of trained specialists worked constantly to identify and respond to statute breaches, erasing magical knowledge from Muggle minds and creating false memories to explain unusual events. The scale of this work was staggering. Some historians estimate that more memory modifications were performed in the first decade after the statute's implementation than in all previous magical history combined. The psychological toll of this work on ministry employees was significant and largely unacknowledged. Memory modification required intimate contact with Muggle minds, exposing magical practitioners to non-magical ways of thinking and feeling that could be profoundly disturbing to those raised in purely magical environments. The constant pressure to maintain perfect secrecy while managing increasingly complex concealment operations led to high rates of stress-related illness and career burnout among ministry staff. International magical cooperation during the ministry's early years was complicated by the fact that different magical governments were implementing the statute according to different timelines and with varying degrees of success. The British ministry found itself serving as both model and consultant for magical governments around the world, sharing expertise in concealment techniques and administrative organization, while learning from the experiences of magical communities facing different challenges. The establishment of formal diplomatic relationships with foreign magical governments required the development of entirely new protocols and procedures. Traditional diplomatic practices, which had assumed open communication and interaction, had to be adapted for a world where magical governments operated in absolute secrecy from their non-magical neighbors. New forms of magical communication, transportation, and documentation were developed to support international cooperation while maintaining strict security standards. The ministry's early crisis management efforts were tested repeatedly by magical disasters that threatened to expose the wizarding world to Muggle attention. Dragon attacks on remote villages required massive memory modification efforts and elaborate cover stories involving gas leaks and structural collapses. Magical creature rampages in populated areas demanded rapid response teams that could contain damage while erasing all evidence of magical involvement. Experimental magic gone wrong created situations that challenged even the most creative concealment specialists. These crisis responses helped establish the ministry's reputation for competence and efficiency, but they also revealed the enormous costs associated with maintaining absolute secrecy. Each major incident required the deployment of dozens of trained specialists, consumed vast quantities of magical resources, and often took months to resolve completely. The financial burden of statute maintenance was far greater than anyone had anticipated, requiring new forms of taxation and resource allocation that strained the magical economy. The ministry's relationship with magical education during its formative years was particularly significant because schools like Hogwarts were training the first generation of magical children to grow up entirely within the first, post-statute world. These young wizards and witches had no personal memory of the old arrangements between magical and non-magical societies, making them both the most natural supporters of complete separation and the most likely to accidentally violate statute requirements through ignorance or carelessness. Educational reform became one of the ministry's highest priorities, as officials recognized that long-term statute maintenance would depend on ensuring that every magical child understood the importance of secrecy and received training in concealment techniques. New subjects were added to magical curricula. Existing courses were modified to emphasize secrecy concerns, and entirely new forms of practical training were developed to prepare students for life in a hidden world. The development of magical commerce and industry during the early ministry period required fundamental changes in how magical businesses operated. Companies that had served both magical and non-magical customers were forced to choose between market segments, often leading to significant financial losses and business reorganization. New magical commercial districts had to be established in concealed locations, supplied through magical transportation networks, and protected by concealment charms that required constant maintenance. The creation of magical employment opportunities for the growing population of post-statute magical Britain became a major governmental concern. The old economy, which had relied heavily on magical services provided to Muggle customers, was no longer viable under statute requirements. New industries had to be developed that could operate entirely within the concealed magical world while providing sufficient employment and economic growth to support magical society's needs. The ministry's early tax and finance policies reflected the unprecedented costs associated with maintaining magical secrecy while providing essential governmental services. Traditional forms of magical taxation, which had been relatively modest during the Council era, proved completely inadequate for funding the ministry's expanded operations. New revenue sources had to be developed, including taxes on magical transportation, concealment services, and international magical trade. The establishment of formal relationships with Gringotts Bank during this period created financial infrastructure that would support magical government operations for centuries to come. The goblins' expertise in magical finance and security made them natural partners for a government that needed to manage complex financial operations while maintaining absolute secrecy about its activities. The partnership was not without tensions, as goblin financial practices sometimes conflicted with ministry policy goals, but it provided essential stability during a period of enormous governmental expansion. The ministry's early personnel policies established precedents that would influence magical government employment for generations. The decision to create a professional civil service based on merit-based selection and career advancement was revolutionary in a magical society that had traditionally operated through personal relationships and family connections. The new system created opportunities for talented individuals from modest backgrounds while establishing performance standards that elevated the overall quality of governmental service. Training programs for ministry employees had to be developed from scratch, as few existing magical institutions had experience in the specialized skills required for governmental administration. New forms of magical education were created that combined traditional magical knowledge with administrative expertise, legal understanding, and the practical skills needed for maintaining statute secrecy while conducting complex governmental operations. The cultural transformation that accompanied the ministry's establishment was as significant as the political and administrative changes. Magical society had to develop new forms of identity and self-understanding that reflected its separation from the non-magical world while maintaining connection to its own historical traditions. New holidays, ceremonies, and cultural practices were established that celebrated magical heritage while reinforcing the importance of secrecy and separation. The ministry's role in supporting and directing this cultural development was both necessary and controversial. Government officials found themselves making decisions about magical traditions, cultural practices, and social customs that previous generations of magical leaders had left to individual choice and community development. The tension between governmental authority and personal freedom became a persistent theme in magical politics that would influence policy debates for centuries. As the first decade of ministry operation drew to a close, magical Britain had been transformed beyond recognition. The ancient wizards' council that had governed magical society for over 3 centuries was now a historical curiosity, remembered fondly by some and dismissed as antiquated by others. The new Ministry of Magic had established itself as a permanent and powerful institution that touched every aspect of magical life while maintaining the absolute secrecy that post-statute survival required. The challenges that lay ahead were immense. International magical cooperation would become increasingly complex, as different magical governments developed their own approaches to statute implementation and magical governance. Domestic policy questions about magical creature rights, educational standards, and economic development would require decisions that balanced competing interests while maintaining essential unity within magical society. The constant pressure of maintaining secrecy while adapting to changing circumstances would test every aspect of magical government organization and capability. Yet the foundation had been laid for what would become one of the most stable and effective magical governments in the world. The ministry's early success in managing the transition from council to professional administration, in maintaining statute secrecy while providing essential services, and in balancing competing interests within magical society, had created institutional traditions and capabilities that would serve magical Britain well in the trials and triumphs that lay ahead. The great transformation was complete, but the real work of magical governance was just beginning. The 18th century dawned upon magical Britain with the promise of stability and growth, as the newly established Ministry of Magic began the delicate work of transforming revolutionary governmental structures into lasting institutions that could serve magical society through whatever challenges lay ahead. The experimental phase of magical administration was giving way to something more permanent and sophisticated, as the lessons learned during the turbulent early years of statute implementation were codified into policies, procedures, and traditions that would define magical governance for generations to come. Ulick Gamp's tenure as the first Minister of Magic had established crucial precedents for how magical government would operate. But his successors faced the equally challenging task of building upon those foundations while adapting to changing circumstances and evolving needs. The second minister, Damocles' role, inherited a governmental structure that was functional but still fragile, dependent on personal relationships and individual expertise rather than robust institutional systems that could survive leadership transitions and policy disagreements. Roll's primary contribution to magical governance was the systematization of ministry operations through the creation of comprehensive procedural manuals, standardized forms, and regular reporting requirements that transformed the informal networks of the early ministry into a professional bureaucracy. His background as a successful magical businessman brought private sector efficiency concepts to government operations, though not without resistance from ministry employees who valued the flexibility and personal autonomy that had characterized the institution's early years. The challenge of managing ministerial succession became apparent during Raoul's unexpected death in office, when competing factions within the ministry struggled to agree on selection procedures for his replacement. The crisis revealed fundamental weaknesses in the governmental structure that Gamp had established, particularly the lack of clear constitutional guidelines for leadership transitions and the informal nature of many key governmental relationships. The resolution required months of negotiations between different ministry departments, each of which had developed its own culture and priorities during the institution's formative years. Perseus Parkinson's selection as the third minister reflected a compromise between different factions within magical government, as his family connections satisfied traditionalists while his progressive policy positions appealed to reformers who wanted continued governmental modernization. Parkinson's administration was marked by the first major expansion of ministry operations beyond the 5 original departments, as the growing complexity of magical society created demands for specialized governmental services that could not be accommodated within the existing organizational structure. The establishment of the Department of Magical Games and Sports during Parkinson's tenure reflected both the increasing prosperity of post-statute magical society and the government's recognition that recreational activities required regulation and oversight to prevent statute violations. The popularity of Quidditch had grown enormously since magical society's separation from the Muggle world, as the sport provided a uniquely magical form of entertainment that could be enjoyed without any risk of exposure to non-magical populations. Organizing the first official Quidditch World Cup under ministry auspices required the development of entirely new governmental capabilities in event management, international coordination, and crowd control. The logistical challenges were immense, as thousands of magical spectators had to be transported, housed, and entertained while maintaining absolute secrecy about their activities. The success of the tournament established the ministry's reputation for competence in managing large-scale magical events while demonstrating the economic benefits of government-sponsored entertainment and recreation. The Goblin Liaison Office emerged during this period, as recognition grew that the ministry's relationship with non-human magical beings required specialized attention and expertise. The goblins' control over magical banking had given them enormous influence over magical society's economic development, but their cultural differences and historical grievances created ongoing tensions that threatened to undermine cooperation essential for magical Britain's prosperity and security. The appointment of the first Goblin Liaison Officer marked a significant step toward acknowledging non-human magical beings as legitimate participants in magical society, rather than simply subjects to be managed and controlled. However, the position's creation also revealed the deep-seated prejudices and cultural assumptions that influenced magical government policy, as the office was clearly designed to manage goblin concerns rather than represent goblin interests within the broader governmental structure. Goblin responses to the liaison office were mixed, with some viewing it as recognition of their importance and others dismissing it as a token gesture designed to provide the appearance of inclusion without granting real political power. The ongoing tensions surrounding goblin rights and representation would remain a persistent challenge for magical government, periodically erupting into open conflict when economic pressures or political changes created opportunities for long-standing grievances to surface. The establishment of the Auror Office as a specialized department within magical law enforcement represented one of the ministry's most significant organizational developments during the 18th century. The growing complexity of magical crime, combined with increasing international cooperation requirements and the specialized skills needed for maintaining statute secrecy, had made it clear that magical law enforcement required professional officers with extensive training and specialized expertise. The first aurors were recruited primarily from the Old Warlock's Watch, but the expansion of the program required the development of comprehensive training curricula that combined traditional magical knowledge with law enforcement techniques, investigative methods, and the psychological preparation needed for confronting dark arts practitioners. The Auror training program became one of the most rigorous educational experiences available in magical Britain, with acceptance rates that made Hogwarts admissions seem routine by comparison. Auror operations during this early period focused primarily on domestic magical crime, as the relative stability of the post-statute world had reduced but not eliminated the threats posed by dark wizards and dangerous magical creatures. The development of standardized investigative procedures, evidence-gathering techniques, and prisoner management protocols established precedents that would influence magical law enforcement for centuries, though the methods used reflected the social attitudes and legal assumptions of their era in ways that later generations would find troubling. The ministry's evolving relationship with Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry during the 18th century reflected the complex balance between institutional autonomy and governmental oversight that would characterize magical education policy for generations. The school's independence had been one of its greatest strengths during the chaotic early years of statute implementation, allowing educational innovation and adaptation without bureaucratic interference. However, the ministry's growing sophistication and confidence led to increasing interest in standardizing magical education and ensuring that graduates possessed the knowledge and skills needed for post-statute magical society. The first formal agreements between the ministry and Hogwarts established basic oversight requirements while preserving the school's traditional autonomy in curriculum development and personnel decisions. Ministry inspectors would periodically review educational standards and ensure compliance with statute secrecy requirements, but day-to-day educational decisions would remain under school control. The compromise satisfied both institutions while creating precedents that would be tested repeatedly as political circumstances and educational needs evolved. Educational standardization efforts during this period focused primarily on ensuring that all magical children received adequate training in concealment techniques, Muggle studies, and the legal requirements associated with maintaining statute secrecy. The development of standardized examinations for magical students created the first systematic approach to measuring educational achievement across different magical schools and private tutoring arrangements. Though the results revealed significant disparities in educational quality and access that reflected broader social inequalities within magical society. The economic systems that emerged during the 18th century established the foundation for magical Britain's long-term prosperity while creating dependencies and vulnerabilities that would influence political development for centuries. The partnership with Gringotts Bank had provided essential financial infrastructure during the ministry's early years, but the goblins' control over magical currency and credit created ongoing tensions about monetary policy and economic sovereignty. The development of magical commerce during this period was shaped by the constraints and opportunities created by statute secrecy requirements. Traditional magical businesses that had served both magical and non-magical customers had been forced to choose market segments, often leading to significant consolidation and specialization. New magical commercial districts had been established in concealed locations, creating concentrated centers of magical economic activity that could be more easily protected and regulated. The ministry's approach to economic regulation during this period was relatively light-handed, reflecting both the limited governmental resources available for oversight activities and the political influence of established magical businesses that preferred minimal interference with their operations. However, the growing importance of maintaining statute secrecy created new regulatory requirements that affected virtually every aspect of magical commerce, from advertising and marketing to product distribution and customer service. Transportation regulation emerged as one of the ministry's most complex administrative challenges during the 18th century, as the growth of magical population and economic activity created unprecedented demands for safe, efficient, and secret transportation systems. The flu network, which had operated informally for centuries, required systematic expansion and regulation to serve as the primary transportation method for magical Britain's geographically dispersed population. The development of flu network standards and regulations required coordination between the ministry, private transportation companies, and local magical communities throughout Britain. Safety requirements had to be established and enforced. Network capacity had to be expanded to meet growing demand, and security measures had to be implemented to prevent unauthorized access or statute violations. The complexity of these challenges required the development of new governmental expertise in transportation, engineering, network management, and regulatory enforcement. Portkey regulation presented different but equally complex challenges, as the magical transportation method's flexibility and convenience made it attractive for both legitimate and illegitimate purposes. The development of licensing requirements for portkey creation and use had to balance public safety concerns with individual freedom of movement, while enforcement mechanisms had to be capable of detecting unauthorized transportation without creating an oppressive surveillance system. The ministry's approach to managing magical accidents and catastrophes evolved significantly during the 18th century, as experience revealed the inadequacy of early response procedures, and the growing sophistication of magical society created new types of emergencies that required specialized expertise. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes was transformed from a small crisis response team into a comprehensive emergency management organization, with specialized units for different types of magical disasters. Memory modification operations became increasingly sophisticated during this period, as ministry specialists developed new techniques for managing large-scale secrecy breaches while minimizing psychological damage to affected Muggle populations. The ethical implications of systematic memory manipulation were largely ignored during this early period, though some ministry employees privately expressed concerns about the long-term effects of extensive magical interference with non-magical minds. The development of magical creature management policies during the 18th century reflected evolving understanding of the complex relationships between wizards and the various non-human magical beings that shared the hidden, magical world. Early policies had been based primarily on traditional prejudices and fears, but growing contact and cooperation revealed the intelligence, capabilities, and legitimate interests of many magical creature communities. Centaur relations presented particular challenges for ministry policymakers, as the proud and independent centaur tribes had their own sophisticated systems of governance and law that often conflicted with ministry regulations. The establishment of centaur reserves and protected areas was intended to provide security and autonomy for centaur communities while preventing conflicts with wizarding settlements. but the implementation revealed fundamental disagreements about land rights, sovereignty, and the nature of magical citizenship. House elf policies during this period reflected the deep-seated social assumptions and economic interests that would make these relationships one of the most problematic aspects of magical society for generations. The systematic exploitation of house elf labor had become so integral to magical household management and economic production that few wizards questioned its morality or sustainability. Despite occasional evidence of house elf intelligence and emotional complexity that challenged simple assumptions about their nature and capabilities. The ministry's international relationships during the 18th century were shaped by the ongoing challenges of implementing and maintaining statute secrecy requirements while developing cooperative relationships with magical basid governments around the world. Different magical communities had adopted varying approaches to statute implementation, creating complex diplomatic challenges as governments sought to coordinate policies while respecting cultural differences and national sovereignty. The establishment of regular diplomatic communications with magical governments in France, Germany, and other European countries led to the development of international magical law and cooperative frameworks that would influence global magical politics for centuries. The British ministry's reputation for administrative competence and statute maintenance made it a natural leader in these international discussions, though cultural differences and historical rivalries sometimes complicated cooperation efforts. Colonial expansion during this period created new challenges and opportunities for magical governance, as British magical authorities sought to extend their influence and control to magical communities in territories claimed by the British Empire. The interaction between magical and non-magical colonial administration created complex jurisdictional questions that required careful coordination between different governmental systems while maintaining strict secrecy about magical activities and capabilities. The development of magical research and innovation during the 18th century was supported by ministry policies that encouraged experimentation and knowledge development, while ensuring that new magical discoveries did not threaten statute secrecy or public safety. The Department of Mysteries expanded its operations significantly during this period, conducting research into fundamental questions of magical theory while developing practical applications that could enhance magical society's capabilities and security. Magical medical research benefited from increased government support during this period, as the isolation from Muggle medical knowledge created both challenges and opportunities for developing uniquely magical approaches to health and healing. The expansion of St. Bray's, Mungo's Hospital, and the development of specialized magical medical training programs reflected growing understanding of the complex relationships between magic and human biology that could be explored without Muggle interference or oversight. The social tensions that emerged during the 18th century reflected the growing stratification and complexity of post-statute magical society, as economic prosperity and governmental expansion created new opportunities for social mobility while reinforcing traditional hierarchies and prejudices. The pureblood families that had dominated the old Wizards' Council adapted successfully to the new ministry system, using their wealth, connections, and political experience to maintain influence, while newer families struggled to establish themselves within established social networks. Educational access became an increasingly important factor in determining social and economic opportunities within magical society, as the ministry's growing complexity created demand for educated employees, while traditional apprenticeship systems became less relevant to the needs of modern magical careers. The disparities in educational quality and accessibility reinforced existing social divisions while creating new forms of inequality based on knowledge and credentials rather than simply birth and family connections. The emergence of a magical middle class during this period represented one of the most significant social developments of the 18th century, as ministry employment, magical commerce, and professional services created economic opportunities for families that lacked the inherited wealth of traditional magical elites. This new middle class brought different values and priorities to magical society, emphasizing merit-based advancement and practical achievement over hereditary status and traditional authority. The ministry's approach to managing social tensions during this period was generally conservative, seeking to maintain stability and order while allowing gradual change and adaptation. The institution's success in providing essential services and maintaining statute secrecy had created broad public support that discouraged radical political movements, though underlying social conflicts would eventually surface when economic or political crises created opportunities for change. The cultural developments that accompanied magical society's maturation during the 18th century reflected both continuity with traditional magical heritage and adaptation to the new realities of post-statute existence. New forms of magical art, literature, and entertainment emerged that celebrated magical identity while reinforcing the importance of secrecy and separation from the non-magical world. The government's role in supporting and shaping these cultural developments was generally subtle but significant, as ministry policies influenced everything from educational curricula to public celebrations. The standardization of magical practices during this period reflected both practical necessities and cultural preferences, as the ministry sought to ensure consistency and safety while respecting regional variations and family traditions. The development of standardized magical measurements, terminology, and procedures facilitated communication and cooperation, while sometimes conflicting with local customs and individual preferences that had developed over centuries of independent practice. Religious and spiritual practices within magical society during the 18th century reflected complex relationships between traditional beliefs, magical capabilities, and post-statute social requirements. The separation from Muggle religious institutions had forced magical communities to develop their own approaches to questions of meaning and purpose. While magical abilities raised theological questions about the nature of divine power and human responsibility that had no clear answers within existing religious frameworks, the ministry's approach to religious questions was generally one of benign neglect, avoiding official positions on theological matters, while ensuring that religious practices did not threaten statute secrecy or public order. The diversity of beliefs and practices within magical society made any governmental religious policy politically risky, while the separation from Muggle religious institutions reduced the social importance of religious affiliation in determining individual identity and community membership. As the 18th century progressed toward its close, the Ministry of Magic had established itself as a permanent and essential institution within magical British society. The experimental governmental structures of the early post-statute period had evolved into sophisticated administrative systems capable of managing the complex requirements of a hidden magical society while adapting to changing circumstances and emerging challenges. The success of magical governance during this period provided a foundation for further expansion and development, but it also revealed persistent weaknesses and unresolved tensions that would challenge future generations of magical leaders. The balance between individual freedom and collective security, between traditional values and innovative practices, between magical isolation and international cooperation, would continue to shape political debates and policy decisions as magical society faced new challenges and opportunities. The institutional traditions and governmental capabilities developed during the 18th century would be tested repeatedly in the centuries that followed, as domestic conflicts, international wars, and social transformations created demands for governmental responses that stretched existing systems and required new forms of magical administration. The foundation had been laid for effective magical governance, But the real tests of institutional strength and adaptability lay ahead. The century that had begun with revolutionary changes in magical government was ending with stable institutions and established traditions that provided both continuity with the past and flexibility for future adaptation. The Ministry of Magic had proven its worth as an administrative system, but its ultimate value would be determined by its ability to serve magical society's needs through whatever trials and transformations the future might bring. The 19th century opened upon magical Britain like a great tome whose pages held both promise and peril, as the Industrial Revolution that was transforming the Muggle world created unprecedented challenges and opportunities for a magical society that had committed itself to absolute secrecy from non-magical populations. The steam engines and factory chimneys that were reshaping the landscape of ordinary Britain existed in a world increasingly separate from the hidden magical communities that had once moved freely among Muggle settlements. Yet the changes in the broader world could not be entirely ignored by those who lived in the shadows cast by progress. The Ministry of Magic that entered this new century bore little resemblance to the experimental institution that had replaced the ancient Wizards' Council less than 100 years earlier. What had begun as a necessary response to the international statute of wizarding secrecy had evolved into a sophisticated governmental apparatus with departments, subdivisions, and specialized offices that employed hundreds of witches and wizards in the complex work of magical administration. The success of this transformation had created both confidence and complacency within magical society, as the relative prosperity and security of the post-statute world encouraged the belief that the major challenges of magical governance had been permanently resolved. The influence of pure-blood families on ministry policy during the 19th century reached heights that would have been unimaginable during the more egalitarian early years of magical government. The Sacred 28, that infamous list compiled by the pure-blood supremacist cantankerous Knot, represented more than social pretension but political reality. As these ancient families used their accumulated wealth, extensive social networks, and carefully cultivated expertise in magical law and administration to dominate the institutions that governed magical society. The Malfoy family's rise to political prominence during this period exemplified the sophisticated methods by which old money exercised influence over magical government without accepting the responsibilities and accountability that came with holding official positions. Armand Malfoy and his descendants perfected the art of political manipulation from behind the scenes, funding political campaigns, providing employment opportunities for ministry officials, and creating networks of obligation and dependency that gave them enormous unofficial power over governmental decisions. The Black family's approach to political influence was more direct but equally effective, as they placed family members in key ministry positions while maintaining the social connections and financial resources necessary to shape policy debates and personnel decisions. Their control over significant portions of magical London's real estate, combined with their extensive library of magical lore and their reputation for legal expertise, made them indispensable advisors to ministry officials who lacked the family resources and institutional knowledge necessary for navigating the complexities of magical administration. The Lestrange family's political influence was built upon their control of magical financial institutions beyond Gringotts, as they had invested heavily in the commercial development that supported magical society's growing prosperity and sophistication. Their ability to provide credit, investment capital, and commercial opportunities for magical businesses gave them leverage over economic policy decisions, while their international connections made them valuable partners for ministry officials dealing with foreign magical governments. These pure-blood families understood that true political power lay not in holding office but in shaping the environment within which office holders operated. They created the social institutions, cultural expectations, and economic relationships that defined what was possible and desirable within magical society. making it unnecessary to control individual policy decisions when they could influence the assumptions and priorities that guided all governmental activity. The creature legislation that emerged during this period represented one of the darkest chapters in magical governmental history, as the ministry succumbed to prejudice and fear in creating legal frameworks that institutionalized discrimination against non-human magical beings. The influence of pure-blood supremacist ideology was evident throughout these legislative efforts, which sought to establish clear hierarchies that placed wizards at the apex of magical society, while reducing other magical beings to subordinate positions that served wizarding interests and convenience. Groganstump's appointment as Minister of Magic in 1811 marked a turning point towards systematic discrimination that would have profound and lasting consequences for magical society's moral development and political stability. His background as a successful businessman and his reputation for administrative efficiency masked deeply held prejudices against non-human magical beings that he justified through pseudo-scientific theories about magical patience, hierarchy and natural order that contradicted centuries of evidence about the intelligence and capabilities of creatures like goblins, centaurs, and house elves. The creation of the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures under Stump's administration represented a fundamental shift from the more collaborative approaches that had characterized earlier magical past governments, where previous administrations had sought to manage relationships with magical creatures through negotiation and mutual accommodation. The new department was explicitly designed to impose wizarding authority over all non-human magical beings within British territory. Werewolf registration laws enacted during this period created precedents for governmental intrusion into personal privacy that would have far-reaching implications beyond their immediate targets. The requirement that werewolves register their condition with ministry authorities, submit to regular monitoring, and accept restrictions on their movement and employment established the principle that magical conditions could justify permanent surveillance and control by governmental agencies. The psychological impact of these policies on the werewolf community was devastating, as they were effectively branded as permanent threats to public safety regardless of their individual character or behavior. The exclusion of werewolves from most forms of magical employment created economic hardships that pushed many toward illegal activities or association with criminal organizations that were willing to exploit their desperation and basely blastic resentment. The ministry's failure to provide alternative economic opportunities for registered werewolves created a self-fulfilling prophecy, as discrimination and marginalization increased the likelihood of the very antisocial behavior that registration was supposedly designed to prevent. The giant conflicts that erupted during the mid-19th century reflected both the ministry's increasingly aggressive approach to magical creature management and the broader social tensions created by pure-blood, supremacist ideology. The giant communities that had coexisted relatively peacefully with wizarding settlements for centuries found themselves subjected to new restrictions and surveillance that threatened their traditional way of life and cultural autonomy. The ministry's response to giant resistance was swift and brutal, employing military tactics that had been developed for use against dark wizards against communities whose primary crime was refusing to accept subordinate status within the new magical hierarchy. The systematic campaign to reduce giant populations and drive survivors into remote mountain regions represented a form of ethnic cleansing that would have been recognized as such if applied to human populations, but was justified as necessary for public safety and magical security. The long-term consequences of anti-giant policies extended far beyond their immediate victims, as the destruction of giant communities eliminated traditional sources of knowledge about magical creatures, ancient magical practices, and the complex relationships between different forms of magical life that had been preserved through oral traditions spanning thousands of years. The ministry's short-sighted focus on immediate control, came at the cost of irreplaceable cultural and magical heritage that would have benefited all of magical society. Centaur treaties negotiated during this period reflected a somewhat more sophisticated approach to magical creature relations, though they were ultimately based on the same fundamental assumptions about wizarding superiority and the right of the ministry to determine the conditions under which other magical beings would be permitted to exist. The establishment of centaur reserves and the restriction of centaur movement to specific geographical areas represented a compromise that avoided the violent conflicts that had characterized giant relations while still asserting governmental control over non-human magical populations. The centaur community's acceptance of these restrictions reflected their pragmatic understanding of the political realities rather than recognition of the ministry's moral or legal authority over their affairs. Centaur leaders recognized that resistance would likely result in the same systematic persecution that had devastated giant communities, and they chose accommodation as the lesser evil while maintaining their cultural autonomy and traditional practices within the boundaries imposed by wizarding law. The intellectual and cultural costs of centaur marginalization were significant for magical society as a whole, as centaur knowledge of astronomy, divination, and natural magic represented sophisticated traditions that could have contributed enormously to magical understanding and development. The ministry's insistence on treating centaurs as subjects rather than partners eliminated opportunities for cooperation and knowledge exchange that would have benefited both communities. House elf legislation during this period represented perhaps the most morally indefensible aspect of 19th century magical creature policy, as the ministry formally institutionalized slavery through legal frameworks that denied house elves basic rights, while protecting the economic interests of wizarding families that depended on their labor. The systematic exploitation of house elf magical abilities and emotional attachments was justified through paternalistic arguments about house elf nature and preferences that served primarily to assuage wizarding consciences, rather than address the fundamental injustices of the system. The legal classification of house elves as property, rather than beings, reflected both the economic importance of their labor to wizarding society and the psychological necessity of denying their obvious intelligence and emotional bimeity, complexity. The ministry's refusal to investigate reports of house elf abuse or to establish minimum standards for their treatment created conditions under which systematic exploitation could flourish without legal consequences or social condemnation. The cultural impact of house elf slavery on wizarding society was profound and largely unrecognized, as the availability of unpaid labor reduced incentives for technological innovation and economic development, while creating social attitudes about work and service that would persist long after the immediate economic benefits had disappeared. The normalization of absolute power over sentient beings also contributed to the development of authoritarian attitudes and practices that would facilitate later acceptance of more overt forms of political oppression. Dark arts regulation during the 19th century reflected growing governmental sophistication in magical law enforcement combined with increasing paranoia about threats to magical security and social order. The expansion of Auror operations and the development of specialized dark arts detection techniques represented genuine improvements in public safety, but they were accompanied by restrictions on magical research and practice that often reflected political considerations rather than legitimate security concerns. The classification of certain forms of magic as inherently dark reflected not only their potential for harm, but also their association with magical traditions and communities that were viewed with suspicion by the pure-blood dominated establishment. Magic practiced by werewolves, giants, and other non-human magical beings was often classified as dark, regardless of its actual effects or intentions, while similar practices employed by respectable wizarding families were considered acceptable traditional magic worthy of protection and preservation. The ministry's approach to dark arts education during this period revealed the contradictions and hypocrisies inherent in their regulatory framework. As students at Hogwarts and other magical schools were taught to fear and avoid dark arts while receiving little practical education about how to recognize or defend against them. This approach served the interests of established magical families, who could provide their children with private education in protective techniques while ensuring that other magical families remained vulnerable to dark arts attacks. International magical expansion during the 19th century created new opportunities for British magical influence, while generating complex challenges for governmental administration and legal authority. The expansion of the British Empire created expectations that magical authorities would extend their jurisdiction to magical communities in colonial territories. But the practical difficulties of governing magical populations across vast distances with limited communication and transportation capabilities made effective administration nearly impossible. The interaction between magical and non-magical colonial administration created jurisdictional conflicts that required careful negotiation and compromise to resolve without exposing magical society to Muggle attention. British magical authorities found themselves operating within frameworks established by Muggle colonial governments while maintaining their own systems of magical law and administration that often conflicted with official colonial policies and procedures. The cultural impact of magical colonialism was profound for both British and colonial magical communities, as the imposition of British magical law and administrative practices disrupted traditional systems of magical governance and cultural practice that had developed over centuries. The Ministry's assumption that British magical practices and values were superior to indigenous magical traditions reflected the same supremacist attitudes that characterized their domestic creature legislation, with similarly destructive consequences for magical diversity and cultural heritage. Azkaban prison's establishment and development during this period represented both a genuine innovation in magical criminal justice and a symbol of the Ministry's increasingly punitive approach to social problems that might have been better addressed through education, economic opportunity, and social reform. The decision to place the Wizarding World's primary prison on a remote island guarded by Dementors reflected both practical security considerations and a desire to isolate criminal behavior from mainstream magical society in ways that prevented rehabilitation and reintegration. The psychological effects of Dementor exposure on Azkaban prisoners represented a form of torture that was technically legal under Ministry regulations, but violated fundamental principles of human dignity and rehabilitation that should have guided criminal justice policy. The Ministry's willingness to employ creatures that fed on human happiness and hope as prison guards revealed a callousness toward prisoner welfare that reflected broader social attitudes about the nature of criminal behavior and the prison guards' purposes of punishment. The long-term social costs of Azkaban's brutal conditions were enormous, as ex-prisoners who survived their sentences often emerged psychologically damaged and socially isolated in ways that increased rather than decreased their likelihood of returning to criminal behavior. The prison's reputation for horror also served as a form of psychological terrorism against potential lawbreakers, but this deterrent effect came at the cost of creating a climate of fear that stifled legitimate dissent and political opposition. The magical research and development that flourished during the 19th century benefited from governmental support and institutional resources while being shaped by the political and social priorities of the pure blood establishment that dominated Ministry policymaking. The Department of Mysteries expanded its operations significantly during this period, conducting research into fundamental questions of magical theory while developing practical applications that enhanced magical society's capabilities and security. The focus of magical research during this period reflected both genuine scientific curiosity and the specific needs and interests of magical society's governing classes. Research into protective magic, concealment techniques, and memory modification received substantial support because of their importance for maintaining statute secrecy and protecting magical communities from external threats. Research into magical creature psychology and physiology was supported primarily insofar as it contributed to more effective methods of control and exploitation rather than understanding and cooperation. The development of new magical transportation methods during this period represented one of the ministry's most successful technological achievements, as the expansion and improvement of the flu network, the standardization of portkey creation and operation, and the development of more sophisticated apparition training programs significantly improved the quality of life for ordinary magical citizens while supporting economic development and social integration. The social stratification that became increasingly pronounced during the 19th century reflected both the success of magical government in providing stability and prosperity and the failure of magical society to develop institutions and values that could sustain egalitarian ideals under conditions of rapid social and economic change. The pure-blood family's domination of political and economic institutions created opportunities for wealth, accumulation, and social advancement that were largely unavailable to families lacking the right connections and cultural ties. Capital. The emergence of magical middle classes during this period represented both progress toward greater social mobility and the creation of new forms of inequality based on education, professional achievement, and access to governmental employment. The expansion of ministry operations created career opportunities for talented individuals from modest backgrounds, but advancement within the governmental hierarchy often required adoption of the social values and cultural practices associated with pure-blood society. Educational access became an increasingly important factor in determining life opportunities within magical society, as the ministry's growing complexity created demand for educated employees while traditional apprenticeship systems became less relevant to the needs of modern magical careers. The disparities in educational quality and accessibility between different magical schools and private tutoring arrangements reinforced existing social divisions while creating new barriers to advancement for talented individuals from poor families. The development of magical capitalism during this period created economic opportunities for entrepreneurial individuals while concentrating wealth and power in ways that undermined the social cohesion and mutual support that had characterized earlier magical communities. The growth of magical commerce and industry provided employment and prosperity for many magical families, but the benefits were distributed unevenly in ways that reflected and reinforced existing social hierarchies and cultural prejudices. The ministry's approach to economic regulation during this period was generally supportive of business interests and private property rights while providing minimal protection for workers or consumers who lacked the political influence necessary to secure governmental intervention on their behalf. The assumption that economic prosperity would automatically benefit all members of magical society proved to be naive, as the concentration of wealth among pure-blood families and successful entrepreneurs created new forms of poverty and social exclusion among those who lacked the resources or opportunities to participate in the magical economy's growth. The cultural developments that accompanied magical society's increasing sophistication during the 19th century reflected both genuine artistic and intellectual achievement and the growing influence of pure-blood values and priorities on magical cultural production. The emergence of distinctively magical forms of art, literature, and entertainment represented creative responses to the unique conditions and experiences of post-statute magical society. But these cultural innovations were often shaped by assumptions about magical superiority and separation that reinforced existing prejudices and social divisions. The standardization of magical practices and terminology during this period facilitated communication and cooperation within magical society, while sometimes suppressing regional variations and minority traditions that represented valuable alternatives to mainstream magical culture. The ministry's role in promoting standardization was generally positive in its effects on magical education and professional practice. But it also contributed to cultural homogenization that reduced the diversity and creativity that had historically been sources of magical innovation and development. Religious and philosophical developments within magical society during the 19th century reflected the complex relationships between traditional beliefs, magical capabilities, and the social changes accompanying industrial development in the broader world. The separation from Muggle religious institutions had forced magical communities to develop their own approaches to questions of meaning and purpose, while magical abilities raised theological and philosophical questions that had no clear answers within existing intellectual frameworks. The ministry's approach to religious and philosophical questions remained one of official neutrality combined with practical policies that often reflected the religious and cultural values of the pure-blood families that dominated governmental institutions. The protection of traditional magical holidays and ceremonies served both cultural preservation and political purposes, while restrictions on certain forms of magical practice reflected concerns about social order and security rather than theological considerations. The international magical relationships that developed during the 19th century reflected both Britain's growing influence within the global magical community and the challenges of maintaining diplomatic relationships while preserving domestic political autonomy and cultural identity. The British ministry's reputation for administrative competence and statute maintenance made it a natural leader in international magical cooperation. Though cultural differences and historical rivalries sometimes complicated these relationships, the development of international magical law during this period represented genuine progress toward creating frameworks for cooperation and conflict resolution between different magical governments. Though these legal systems often reflected the interests and values of the most powerful magical nations rather than the needs and rights of smaller or less developed magical communities. The British ministry's influence on international magical legal development was generally positive, though it sometimes served narrow British interests rather than broader principles of justice and equality. As the 19th century progressed toward its tumultuous conclusion, the Ministry of Magic had evolved into an institution of enormous complexity and capability, managing the affairs of a magical society that had achieved unprecedented prosperity and security within its hidden world. The governmental structures and administrative procedures that had been experimental innovations during the early post-statute period had become established traditions that seemed permanent and unchangeable to most magical citizens. Yet beneath the surface of official success and social stability, tensions were building that would challenge every assumption about magical governance and social organization. The systematic discrimination against magical creatures had created resentments and grievances that would eventually demand resolution through reform or revolution. The concentration of political and economic power among pure-blood families had created social divisions that undermined the unity and mutual support essential for democratic governance. The isolation from the non-magical world had fostered attitudes of superiority and separation that would prove inadequate for dealing with the global challenges and conflicts that lay ahead. The institutional capabilities and governmental traditions developed during the 19th century would provide essential foundations for meeting these challenges, but they would also need to be supplemented by new forms of leadership, new approaches to social problems, and new understandings of magical society's responsibilities to all of its members. The century that had begun with confidence in the permanence of post-statute arrangements was ending with questions about whether those arrangements could survive the pressures and contradictions they had created. The Ministry of Magic that entered the 20th century was both stronger and more vulnerable than its creators had imagined possible. Its administrative sophistication and institutional resources were unmatched in magical governmental history, but its dependence on social divisions and cultural prejudices that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain created vulnerabilities that would be tested by the crises and transformations that lay ahead. The foundations had been laid for effective magical governance, but the true test of institutional strength and moral purpose was about to begin. The 20th century dawned upon magical Britain with the weight of industrial smoke and the thunder of distant cannons echoing across a world that seemed to be accelerating beyond the comprehension of ordinary minds. As the Muggle nations of Europe prepared for conflicts of unprecedented scale and brutality that would reshape civilization itself, for the wizarding world, hidden behind veils of secrecy that had protected magical communities for over 2 centuries, these global upheavals presented challenges that tested every assumption about the wisdom of isolation and the sustainability of complete separation from the broader currents of human history. The Ministry of Magic that entered this tumultuous century bore the confidence of institutional success and the complacency of prolonged security, as nearly 300 years of effective governance had created the illusion that magical society had transcended the conflicts and crises that plagued the non-magical world. The sophisticated administrative apparatus that managed every aspect of magical life, from the regulation of flu powder to the prosecution of dark arts offenses, seemed adequate for any challenge that might arise within the controlled environment of hidden magical communities. Yet, the first tremors of change began to manifest even before the Great War erupted across Europe. As reports reached the Ministry of unusual magical activities in remote corners of the continent where ancient magical communities were experiencing disruptions that could not be explained by normal patterns of magical accident or criminal behavior, strange disappearances of prominent magical families, unexplained failures of protective charms that had functioned reliably for generations, and disturbing accounts of magical experiments that seemed to violate fundamental principles of magical law created an atmosphere of unease that penetrated even the most secure magical enclaves. The name Gellert Grindelwald first appeared in ministry files during this early period as a brilliant young wizard whose academic achievements at Durmstrang Institute had earned him recognition throughout the European magical academic community, but whose political writings and public speeches revealed radical ideas about the proper relationship between magical and non-magical populations that challenged the foundational principles of the International Statute of Wizarding, secrecy, his vision of magical supremacy, and his arguments for abandoning concealment in favor of open magical rule over Muggle populations attracted support from disaffected elements within magical society who believed that centuries of hiding had weakened magical culture and stunted magical development. The initial ministry response to reports of Grindelwald's activities was characteristic of the institution's tendency toward conservative caution and bureaucratic deliberation, as officials assumed that the young wizard's radical rhetoric would naturally moderate as he matured, and that his influence would remain confined to academic circles and idealistic students who lacked practical understanding of the complexities involved in magical governance. This complacent assessment proved to be catastrophically wrong, as Grindelwald's charisma and intellectual brilliance enabled him to build a movement that transcended national boundaries and attracted followers from across the spectrum of magical society. The outbreak of the Great War in 1914 created opportunities for Grindelwald's ideology that ministry analysts had failed to anticipate, as the unprecedented scale of Muggle violence and the apparent inability of non-magical governments to maintain peace and order seemed to validate his arguments about Muggle inferiority and the necessity of magical intervention. The war's revelation of previously unimaginable human capacity for systematic brutality and technological destruction provided powerful propaganda for those who argued that magical concealment had become not just unnecessary but morally indefensible. The Ministry's efforts to maintain statute secrecy during the war years required unprecedented coordination with Muggle authorities and massive deployment of memory modification specialists to manage the magical accidents and emergency interventions that became inevitable when magical families found themselves caught in war zones or forced to use magic to protect themselves and their communities from military violence. The scale of these operations strained Ministry resources while revealing the practical limitations of concealment policies under conditions of total warfare and social breakdown. Memory modification programs during this period reached levels of systematic implementation that troubled even experienced Ministry operatives. As teams of specialists worked around the clock to erase magical knowledge from the minds of soldiers, refugees, and civilians who had witnessed magical interventions or accidents under wartime conditions. The psychological toll of this work was enormous, as repeated exposure to traumatized minds and the constant pressure to maintain perfect secrecy while managing increasingly complex concealment operations led to high rates of stress-related illness and career burnout among Ministry staff. The international magical security concerns that emerged during the war years reflected both the breakdown of normal diplomatic relationships between magical governments and the growing influence of radical ideologies that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying international magical cooperation. Grindelwald's success in recruiting followers from multiple countries created security threats that could not be addressed through normal diplomatic channels. While his ideologies appealed to magical supremacist sentiments present in many magical communities, made it difficult to distinguish between legitimate political opposition and active collaboration with dangerous revolutionary movements. The Ministry's coordination with other magical governments during this period revealed both the strengths and limitations of international magical cooperation. As different national approaches to statute maintenance and internal security created conflicts over jurisdiction, information sharing, and coordinated responses to transnational threats. The British Ministry's reputation for administrative competence made it a natural leader in these international efforts, but cultural differences and historical rivalries sometimes hindered the cooperation that effective anti-Grindelwald operations required. Dumbledore's emergence as a significant figure in anti-Grindelwald efforts created both opportunities and complications for Ministry policy, as his intellectual brilliance and moral authority made him an invaluable ally, while his independence and occasionally unorthodox methods created tensions with established governmental procedures and bureaucratic hierarchies. The relationship between Dumbledore and Ministry leadership during this period established patterns of cooperation and conflict that would influence magical politics for decades, as both sides recognized their mutual dependence while struggling to reconcile different approaches to magical governance and security policy. The Auror Department's expansion during the war years represented the most significant military buildup in magical government history, as the scale of the Grindelwald threat required the development of specialized capabilities for combat operations, intelligence gathering, and international coordination that went far beyond traditional magical law enforcement. The recruitment and training of wartime aurors drew heavily on military models adapted for magical combat, though the unique challenges of fighting dark wizards required innovative approaches that combined conventional military tactics with distinctively magical strategies and techniques. Auror training programs during this period emphasized practical combat skills and psychological preparation for the moral complexities of wartime service, as officers would be required to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure while maintaining the ethical standards that distinguished them from the dark wizards they fought. The development of new combat techniques, protective spells, and investigative methods during this period established foundations for magical law enforcement that would influence Auror operations for generations. The specialized anti-Grindelwald units that emerged during this period represented the cutting edge of magical military science as they developed techniques for tracking dark wizards across national boundaries, disrupting complex magical defenses, and coordinating large-scale operations involving multiple magical governments. These elite forces operated with greater autonomy and authority than traditional Auror units, though their methods sometimes raised concerns about accountability and oversight that reflected broader tensions between security requirements and democratic governance. HP Ministry 2. Emergency powers legislation enacted during the Grindelwald crisis established precedents for expanded governmental authority that would influence magical law and political development long after the immediate threat had passed. The Ministry's assumption of extraordinary powers for surveillance, detention, and resource mobilization was justified as temporary necessity, but the institutional changes and legal precedents created during this period proved difficult to reverse once normal conditions returned. The controversial implementation of these emergency measures reflected the difficulty of balancing security requirements with individual rights and democratic accountability under conditions of existential threat. The Ministry's use of expanded surveillance powers, preventive detention authority, and resource requisition capabilities was generally accepted by a magical public that understood the gravity of the Grindelwald threat. But these measures also created opportunities for abuse and established governmental capabilities that could be misused by future administrations with different priorities and values. Magical creature alliances during the war years represented both tactical necessity and missed opportunity for broader social reform. As the Ministry sought to recruit non-human magical beings for anti-Grindelwald operations while maintaining the discriminatory legal frameworks that had marginalized these communities for over a century. The participation of goblins, centaurs, and other magical creatures in wartime operations demonstrated their capabilities and loyalty in ways that should have challenged established prejudices. But most Ministry officials viewed these alliances as temporary expedients rather than foundations for permanent changes in magical creature rights and status. The Goblin contribution to anti-Grindelwald efforts was particularly significant, as their expertise in magical security and their international banking connections provided crucial intelligence about dark wizard financing and logistics. The wartime cooperation between Ministry forces and Goblin security specialists demonstrated the potential benefits of genuine partnership, though these collaborative relationships were largely abandoned once the immediate crisis ended and normal political considerations reasserted their influence over governmental policy. Centaur participation in reconnaissance and communication operations revealed capabilities that had been largely ignored or dismissed by previous generations of Ministry officials, as their knowledge of natural magic and their sophisticated understanding of magical creature communities provided valuable intelligence about Grindelwald's recruitment efforts and operational methods. The respect and gratitude expressed by Auror commanders who worked with Centaur allies during wartime operations stood in stark contrast to the official discrimination and marginalization that characterized peacetime creature policy. Wartime magical research and development efforts produced innovations that revolutionized both military and civilian applications of magic. As the pressure of existential conflict accelerated magical innovation in ways that would have taken decades to achieve under normal conditions. The development of new protective spells, communication techniques, and transportation methods during this period reflected both the creative potential of magical research and the catalytic effects of urgent practical necessity. The Department of Mystery's wartime operations expanded far beyond traditional research activities to include intelligence analysis, counterintelligence operations, and the development of classified magical techniques that could provide strategic advantages in the struggle against Grindelwald's forces. The secrecy that surrounded these activities was even greater than normal, as the ministry recognized that some magical innovations were too dangerous or politically sensitive to be revealed even to allied magical governments. Memory research conducted during this period reflected both genuine scientific curiosity about magical consciousness and the practical military need for improved interrogation and information extraction techniques. The ethical implications of this research were largely ignored during the wartime emergency, though some ministry researchers privately expressed concerns about the long-term consequences of systematic magical manipulation of human consciousness and memory. Post-war reconstruction efforts following Grindelwald's defeat in 1945 required massive coordination between magical governments and unprecedented investment in magical infrastructure, repair, and social rehabilitation programs. The scale of destruction caused by Grindelwald's forces had affected not only physical infrastructure, but also social institutions and cultural relationships that would take generations to fully repair and restore. The trials of Grindelwald's collaborators and followers created complex legal and political challenges for magical governments that had limited experience with international war crimes, prosecution, and little precedent for dealing with ideological movements that had transcended national boundaries. The British ministry's role in these proceedings established important precedents for international magical law, while revealing the difficulties of balancing justice, reconciliation, and security considerations in post-conflict environments. The integration of wartime refugees and displaced persons into magical British society created both humanitarian opportunities and social tensions. As established magical communities struggled to accommodate newcomers whose different cultural backgrounds and traumatic wartime experiences sometimes conflicted with traditional expectations about magical social behavior and cultural conformity. The ministry's refugee assistance programs were generally effective in providing immediate practical support, though longer-term integration efforts revealed persistent prejudices and cultural barriers that hindered full social acceptance. The new international magical order that emerged from the post-war settlement reflected both the lessons learned from the Grindelwald crisis and the political realities of magical great power relationships. The British ministry's enhanced international status and influence created opportunities for leadership in global magical affairs, while imposing new responsibilities for maintaining international stability and preventing future conflicts. The establishment of enhanced international magical cooperation mechanisms during this period created frameworks for information sharing, joint operations, and coordinated responses to transnational threats that would prove essential for dealing with future security challenges. The British ministry's expertise in international coordination and its reputation for reliability made it a natural leader in these cooperative efforts, though the demands of international leadership sometimes conflicted with domestic political priorities and resource limitations. Magical education reform during the post-war period reflected both the lessons learned about the importance of civic education and moral development, and the practical need to prepare young wizards and witches for a world that had become more complex and dangerous than previous generations had experienced. The expansion of defense against the dark arts curricula and the introduction of new courses on international magical relations and comparative magical government reflected recognition that magical isolation could no longer provide complete protection from global threats and challenges. The domestic policy changes that followed Grindelwald's defeat included modest improvements in magical creature rights and some reduction in the most overt forms of discrimination. Though these reforms fell far short of the comprehensive social justice initiatives that wartime cooperation and sacrifice should have justified, the ministry's reluctance to challenge established pure-blood privileges and institutional prejudices reflected both political caution and genuine uncertainty about how quickly magical society could adapt to more egalitarian values and practices. Civil rights advances during this period were limited but symbolically significant, as the wartime contributions of magical creatures, Muggle-born wizards, and other marginalized groups had made it difficult to maintain the most extreme forms of official discrimination. The gradual expansion of educational and employment opportunities for previously excluded groups created precedents that would influence later civil rights movements. Though progress remained slow and often faced fierce resistance from traditionalist elements within magical society, economic reconstruction during the post-war years created opportunities for magical businesses and entrepreneurs, while revealing the limitations of traditional pure-blood economic dominance in a world that increasingly demanded technical expertise and international connections rather than simply inherited wealth and social status. The expansion of magical commerce and the development of new magical industries created employment opportunities for talented individuals from diverse backgrounds while challenging some traditional assumptions about magical social hierarchy. The social changes that accompanied post-war economic development included the emergence of a more diverse and educated magical middle class, increased social mobility for families with merit-based achievements, and gradual erosion of some traditional barriers between different segments of magical society. These changes created both opportunities and tensions, as established elites struggled to maintain their privileges, while newer groups sought recognition and advancement based on their contributions and capabilities. Cultural developments during the post-war period reflected both traumatic wartime experiences and renewed appreciation for magical heritage and identity. As communities that had survived Grindelwald's attacks sought to rebuild their cultural institutions while incorporating lessons learned about the dangers of extremism and the importance of tolerance and mutual respect. The emergence of new forms of magical art, literature, and entertainment during this period reflected both creative responses to wartime trauma and renewed confidence in magical society's future prospects. The commemoration of wartime sacrifice and heroism became an important aspect of post-war magical culture, as communities sought to honor those who had died fighting against Grindelwald while preserving memories and lessons that could guide future generations. The establishment of memorial sites, educational programs, and cultural events dedicated to wartime memory reflected both genuine grief and loss, and recognition of the importance of historical memory for maintaining social cohesion and political stability. Religious and philosophical developments during the post-war period reflected deep questions about the nature of good and evil, the responsibilities of magical power, and the proper relationship between magical and non-magical populations that the Grindelwald crisis had forced magical society to confront. The emergence of new forms of magical spirituality and ethical reflection represented creative responses to moral and philosophical challenges that traditional magical culture had been ill-equipped to address. The ministry's approach to these cultural and philosophical developments remained generally supportive of diversity and free expression while maintaining careful oversight of any ideological movements that might threaten social stability or revive dangerous supremacist ideas. The balance between protecting freedom of thought and preventing the emergence of new extremist movements required constant attention and careful judgment from ministry officials who understood both the importance of intellectual freedom and the dangers of ideological radicalization. As the post-war period gave way to the challenges and opportunities of the 1950s and 60s, magical British society had been fundamentally transformed by its encounter with systematic evil and its successful resistance to totalitarian ideology. The institutional capabilities developed during the wartime emergency provided foundations for more effective magical governance, while the moral lessons learned through confrontation with extremism created new standards for evaluating political leadership, and social policy. The confidence that came from successful resistance to Grindelwald's threat was tempered by recognition that vigilance remained necessary, and that the conditions that had made such extremism possible could emerge again under different circumstances. The Ministry of Magic that emerged from this trial by fire was both stronger and more aware of its limitations than the institution that had entered the century with confidence in its permanent security and institutional adequacy. The foundations had been laid for more sophisticated approaches to magical governance and international cooperation. But the ultimate test of these developments would come with new challenges that would require all the wisdom and capability that wartime experience had developed. The defeat of Grindelwald had preserved magical civilization, but the work of building a more just and secure magical world remained incomplete and would require continued effort and commitment from future generations of magical leaders and citizens. The post-war prosperity that settled over magical Britain like a gentle summer evening brought with it the dangerous illusion that the great struggles of magical history had been permanently resolved. As the 1950s and 60s witnessed an unprecedented expansion of magical commerce, cultural development, and social confidence that created the impression that Grindelwald's defeat had ushered in a golden age of permanent peace and progress. The Ministry of Magic that governed this prosperous magical society had grown into an institution of remarkable sophistication and capability, its departments and subdivisions managing every aspect of magical life with an efficiency that seemed to validate the wisdom of centralized magical administration and professional governmental service. Yet beneath the surface of official optimism and material prosperity, subtle changes were taking place within magical society that would prove to have profound and terrifying consequences for the future of wizarding civilization. The pure-blood supremacist ideologies that had been temporarily discredited by their association with Grindelwald's extremism had not disappeared but had gone underground, evolving and adapting in ways that made them more sophisticated and ultimately more dangerous than the crude racial theories that had characterized earlier forms of magical bigotry. The emergence of Tom Marvolo Riddle as a figure of growing influence within certain circles of magical society during this period was initially overlooked by ministry officials who were focused on more obvious threats and who failed to recognize the signs of a new form of dark wizard whose ambitions and capabilities would eventually dwarf those of any previous threat to magical civilization. Riddle's background as a brilliant Hogwarts student and his early employment at Borgin and Burke's had provided him with access to dark magical artifacts and forbidden knowledge, while allowing him to study the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of magical society from within respectable institutions. His early ministry connections, developed through carefully cultivated relationships with influential officials and pure-blood families, provided him with intelligence about governmental operations and policy decisions that proved invaluable for his long-term planning and strategic development. The young man who would eventually become Lord Voldemort understood that lasting power could not be achieved through dramatic gestures or public confrontation, but required patient infiltration of existing institutions and systematic corruption of the values and relationships that held magical society together. The first signs of organized dark arts activity that would eventually coalesce into the Death Eater movement appeared in ministry files during the late 1950s as isolated incidents of magical violence and intimidation that seemed to target specific individuals and families without obvious connections or common characteristics. The pattern was subtle enough to escape immediate recognition as systematic terrorism, particularly since the perpetrators used techniques that made their crimes appear to be random accidents or the work of disturbed individuals rather than coordinated political action. The ministry's initial response to these incidents reflected the institutional complacency and analytical limitations that had developed during the prosperous post-war years. as officials assumed that isolated magical crimes could be investigated and resolved through traditional law enforcement methods without recognizing the emerging threat of a new form of magical terrorism that was qualitatively different from anything they had previously encountered. The appointment of Nobby Leach as Minister of Magic during this crucial period represented both genuine progress toward magical equality and a strategic vulnerability that dark forces would exploit with devastating effectiveness. Leach's selection as the first Muggle-born minister reflected changing social attitudes within magical society and the growing political influence of merit-based achievement over hereditary privilege. But his appointment also triggered a coordinated campaign of resistance from pure-blood supremacist elements who viewed his success as an existential threat to their traditional dominance. The pure-blood resistance to Leach's administration went far beyond normal political opposition to include systematic harassment, economic pressure, and ultimately violent intimidation that revealed the depth of supremacist sentiment within magical society and the extent to which extremist ideologies had penetrated respectable institutions. The campaign against Leach was coordinated with sophisticated understanding of political psychology and media manipulation, using techniques that would later become standard methods for Death Eater political warfare. The forced resignation of Minister Leach under circumstances that were never fully explained to the magical public represented a crucial victory for supremacist forces and a devastating defeat for magical democracy that demonstrated the vulnerability of democratic institutions to systematic extremist pressure. The ministry's inability or unwillingness to protect its own elected leadership from terrorist intimidation sent a clear message about the limits of governmental authority and the continuing power of traditional magical elites. The escalation of dark arts activity during the 1960s reflected both the growing confidence of supremacist movements and the emergence of more sophisticated organizational structures that could coordinate complex operations across multiple magical communities. The transformation of isolated incidents into systematic campaigns of terror required leadership, resources, and strategic planning that indicated the involvement of highly intelligent and well-connected individuals with access to significant magical and financial resources. The ministry's belated recognition of the Death Eater threat came only after the movement had established itself as a significant force within magical society and had begun to attract followers from across the spectrum of pure-blood families and dark arts practitioners. The institutional failures that allowed this threat to develop largely unrecognized reflected both specific intelligence and analytical deficiencies and broader cultural blindness to the persistence of extremist ideologies within seemingly respectable magical society. Auror operations during the early phases of the Voldemort threat were hampered by both inadequate intelligence about Death Eater organization and methods and political constraints that limited the aggressive investigative techniques that effective counter-terrorism required. The ministry's commitment to civil liberties and due process, while admirable in principle, proved inadequate for dealing with terrorists who acknowledged no legal or moral constraints and who used democratic freedoms as tactical advantages in their war against democratic institutions. The authorization of unforgivable curses for Auror use during the First Wizarding War represented one of the most controversial and morally complex decisions in ministry history. As officials struggled to balance the practical necessities of fighting dark wizards who used these techniques routinely against the fundamental principles of magical law and civilized governance that distinguished legitimate authority from terrorist violence, the decision reflected both recognition of the extraordinary nature of the threat and dangerous precedent setting that would influence magical law enforcement for generations. Barty Crouch Sr.'s leadership of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement during the war years exemplified both the strengths and dangers of emergency powers and wartime authority. As his aggressive approach to Death Eater prosecution achieved significant tactical successes while establishing precedents for governmental overreach and abuse of civil liberties that troubled even his supporters. Crouch's willingness to use harsh methods against suspected Death Eaters reflected genuine commitment to protecting magical society, but his approach also revealed authoritarian tendencies that were potentially as dangerous as the threats they were meant to address. The personal tragedy that befell the Crouch family when Barty Crouch Jr. was revealed as a Death Eater demonstrated the extent to which Voldemort's influence had penetrated even the most dedicated anti-Death Eater families, and Bartcate showed how the war's moral complexities could destroy personal relationships and individual lives in ways that transcended simple categories of victory and defeat. Crouch Sr.'s decision to publicly prosecute his own son reflected both admirable commitment to justice and tragic failure to understand how personal relationships and family bonds could be manipulated by sophisticated enemies. The Order of the Phoenix's emergence as an unofficial response to perceived ministry inadequacies revealed both the limitations of governmental institutions under extreme pressure and the continuing vitality of voluntary associations and personal networks within magical society that could supplement official responses to existential threats. Dumbledore's leadership of the Order reflected his unique position within magical society and his understanding that some forms of resistance could not be conducted through official channels without compromising their effectiveness or legitimacy. The relationship between the Order and official ministry operations was necessarily complex and sometimes conflicted, as both organizations shared common goals while operating according to different principles and constraints that sometimes put them at cross purposes. The ministry's need for accountability, legal authority, and political legitimacy conflicted with the Order's flexibility, secrecy, and willingness to operate outside normal legal frameworks when circumstances required extraordinary measures. Internal corruption within the ministry during the war years reached levels that threatened the institution's basic functionality and legitimacy, as Death Eater infiltration of governmental departments provided Voldemort's forces with intelligence, early warning of Auror operations, and opportunities to sabotage anti-Death Eater activities from within the system. The discovery of systematic betrayal within trusted institutions created psychological trauma and institutional paranoia that would influence ministry culture and operations for decades. The Imperious Curse's use as a weapon of political warfare represented one of Voldemort's most sophisticated and devastating innovations, as the curse's ability to control behavior while leaving victims apparently free-willed made it nearly impossible to distinguish between genuine collaboration and magical coercion. The ministry's development of detection methods and legal frameworks for dealing with Imperious victims reflected both technical innovation and moral complexity, as officials struggled to balance compassion for victims against security requirements and public safety concerns. The intelligence failures that characterized much of the war effort reflected both the inherent difficulties of penetrating highly secretive terrorist organizations and specific institutional weaknesses within ministry intelligence services that had developed during the peaceful post-war decades. The ministry's intelligence capabilities had been designed primarily for normal criminal investigation and routine security monitoring, rather than the sophisticated counterintelligence operations that effective anti-terrorism required. The propaganda warfare that accompanied the physical conflict demonstrated Voldemort's understanding of modern political communication and his ability to exploit magical media for strategic advantage, as Death Eater influence within magical publishing and journalism created opportunities for misinformation campaigns that undermined public confidence in governmental competence while spreading fear and confusion that served terrorist objectives. The Ministry's relatively unsophisticated approach to public communication left it vulnerable to manipulation and unable to effectively counter Death Eater propaganda. International magical cooperation during the war was complicated by different national approaches to Death Eater threats and varying levels of Voldemort's influence in different magical communities. As some foreign magical governments were reluctant to acknowledge the extent of the threat, while others were already compromised by Death Eater infiltration or intimidation. The British Ministry's efforts to coordinate international responses were hampered by diplomatic protocols and sovereignty concerns that prevented the rapid, decisive action that effective counter-terrorism required. The economic warfare that accompanied the Death Eater campaign included systematic attacks on magical commerce, transportation, and financial institutions that were designed to undermine public confidence in governmental competence while creating economic hardship that could be exploited for recruitment purposes. The Ministry's efforts to protect magical economic infrastructure required unprecedented coordination between governmental and private sector security services, while imposing costs that strained magical Britain's financial resources. Civilian protection programs during the war years required the development of new governmental capabilities for population monitoring, evacuation planning, and emergency services that went far beyond traditional ministry functions and created new forms of relationship between magical government and ordinary magical citizens. The success of these programs in minimizing civilian casualties was significant, though the social and psychological costs of living under constant threat created trauma that would influence magical society for generations. The Longbottom torture and its aftermath represented one of the war's most tragic incidents and demonstrated both the limits of governmental protection capabilities and the personal costs that public service could exact from dedicated ministry employees and their families. The destruction of Alice and Frank Longbottom's minds through prolonged torture created both a rallying point for anti-Death Eater sentiment and a stark reminder of the stakes involved in the conflict between civilization and barbarism. The war's impact on magical education was profound and lasting. As schools like Hogwarts struggled to maintain normal educational functions while adapting to security requirements and preparing students for a world that had become far more dangerous and complex than previous generations had experienced. The expansion of defense against the dark arts education and the introduction of practical combat training reflected recognition that academic knowledge alone was insufficient preparation for life in a world threatened by systematic evil. The psychological warfare employed by Death Eaters included systematic campaigns of terror designed to break the morale of magical communities and create conditions of fear and despair that would facilitate recruitment while undermining resistance to extremist ideology. The Ministry's limited understanding of psychological warfare and lack of appropriate countermeasures left magical communities vulnerable to manipulation and intimidation that proved as effective as physical violence in achieving Death Eater objectives. The Potter family's emergence as symbols of resistance to Death Eater terrorism reflected both their personal courage and their strategic importance as targets for Voldemort's campaign to eliminate opposition leadership, as their survival and continued resistance provided inspiration for other magical families while demonstrating that effective opposition to Death Eater terror was possible despite enormous personal risks and costs. The prophecy concerning Harry Potter and its influence on Voldemort's strategic decisions represented one of the war's most significant intelligence failures, as the Ministry's inability to protect classified information from Death Eater infiltration provided Voldemort with knowledge that would shape his tactical priorities while creating vulnerabilities that would ultimately contribute to his defeat. The prophecy's existence and partial contents became powerful psychological weapons that influenced the behavior of all parties to the conflict. The final phase of the First Wizarding War was characterized by escalating violence and increasingly desperate measures by both sides. As Death Eater terrorism reached unprecedented levels while Ministry and Order responses became more aggressive and less constrained by normal legal and ethical limitations. The breakdown of normal social and political constraints created conditions that tested every assumption about civilized behavior and democratic governance under extreme pressure. The mysterious circumstances surrounding Voldemort's first defeat and Harry Potter's survival at Godric's Hollow created both relief and confusion within magical society, as the sudden end of systematic terrorism was welcomed while the unexplained nature of Voldemort's disappearance left fundamental questions about the threat's permanence unresolved. The Ministry's inability to provide satisfactory explanations for these events created information gaps that would be filled by speculation and mythology rather than factual analysis. The immediate aftermath of Voldemort's defeat was characterized by a mixture of celebration, vengeance, and institutional confusion. As magical society struggled to process the trauma of extended terrorism, while dealing with the practical challenges of investigating war crimes, prosecuting collaborators, and rebuilding damaged institutions. The Ministry's response to these challenges revealed both admirable commitment to legal justice and dangerous tendencies towards summary punishment that reflected the war's corrupting influence on previously civilized institutions. The trials of captured Death Eaters represented one of the post-war period's greatest challenges and most significant failures, as the Ministry's commitment to legal due process conflicted with public demands for swift justice, while the complexity of determining individual guilt and responsibility in cases involving magical coercion made fair adjudication nearly impossible. The use of Veritaserum and other magical interrogation techniques raised fundamental questions about civil liberties and the limits of acceptable governmental power that were never satisfactorily resolved. The Imperious Curse defense employed by many accused Death Eaters created legal and moral complexities that exposed weaknesses in magical jurisprudence and revealed the inadequacy of existing legal frameworks for dealing with crimes committed under magical compulsion. The Ministry's inconsistent handling of these cases created resentment and suspicion that would influence magical politics for decades while allowing some genuine war criminals to escape appropriate punishment. The social reconciliation efforts that followed the war's end were hampered by the depth of divisions that had been created or revealed during the conflict, as families and communities that had been divided by ideology, collaboration, or simple survival choices struggled to rebuild relationships and trust that had been damaged or destroyed by years of fear and violence. The Ministry's limited capabilities for social healing and community building left much of this essential work to voluntary organizations and individual initiative. The institutional reforms implemented during the post-war reconstruction period were designed to address the intelligence failures, security weaknesses, and corruption vulnerabilities that had been revealed during the Death Eater crisis. Though the effectiveness of these reforms was limited by political constraints and the Ministry's reluctance to acknowledge the full extent of its institutional failures, the balance between necessary security improvements and preservation of democratic values and civil liberties remained a source of ongoing tension and debate. The commemoration of war heroes and victims became an important aspect of post-war magical culture as communities sought to honor sacrifice while preserving lessons that could guide future responses to extremist threats. Though the politicization of memory and the tendency towards selective commemoration sometimes served partisan purposes rather than genuine historical understanding and moral education. As the post-war period gave way to the apparent peace and prosperity of the 1980s, magical British society carried both visible and hidden scars from its encounter with systematic evil and organized terrorism. The institutional capabilities developed during the emergency had strengthened magical government in some respects while creating new vulnerabilities and dependencies that would be tested when new threats emerged under different circumstances. The confidence that came from surviving Voldemort's first rise was tempered by recognition that the conditions that had made such extremism possible remained largely unchanged, and that vigilance would be required to prevent the Papal-led Ninth Immergence. Emergence of new forms of magical terrorism and political violence. The ministry that emerged from this trial was both more experienced and more cynical than the institution that had entered the conflict with assumptions about the permanence of post-war peace and the adequacy of normal governmental procedures for maintaining social order. The foundations had been laid for more sophisticated approaches to magical security and counter-terrorism. But the ultimate test of these developments would come with challenges that would require all the wisdom and capability that wartime experience had developed, while demanding new forms of courage and leadership that could preserve democratic values under conditions of existential threat. The decade of the 1990s dawned upon magical Britain with the comfortable glow of victory secured and lessons learned. As the wizarding world settled into what many believed would be a permanent era of peace and prosperity built upon the foundations of hard-won experience and institutional wisdom gained through triumph over the darkest forces that past magical society had ever confronted. The Ministry of Magic that governed this confident and prosperous magical community had evolved into an institution of remarkable sophistication and apparent competence. Its various departments and specialized offices managing the complex requirements of hidden magical civilization with an efficiency that seemed to validate every assumption about the superiority of professional administration over the informal governance structures of earlier eras. Yet, the very success that characterized this peaceful interlude contained within it the seeds of institutional complacency and political miscalculation that would prove catastrophic when new challenges emerged from unexpected directions. As the ministry's leadership came to believe that past victories guaranteed future security, and that the governmental structures that had served adequately during previous crises would automatically prove sufficient for whatever threats might arise in the future. This dangerous overconfidence was epitomized by the selection of Cornelius Fudge as Minister of Magic, a choice that reflected the wizarding public's desire for ordinary competence and administrative continuity, rather than the exceptional leadership and moral courage that extraordinary circumstances would soon demand. Fudge's rise to the highest office in magical government was itself a testament to the democratic institutions and merit-based selection processes that had gradually displaced the hereditary privileges and family connections that had once dominated magical politics. Though his selection also revealed the limitations of normal political processes when faced with candidates whose fundamental inadequacies were masked by surface competence and conventional respectability. His career as a junior administrator in various ministry departments had provided him with extensive knowledge of governmental procedures and bureaucratic management, while failing to develop the strategic thinking, moral imagination, and personal courage that effective leadership required. The early years of Fudge's administration were marked by the kind of routine competence and incremental progress that satisfied both magical citizens who wanted stable governance and ministry employees who preferred predictable procedures over dramatic innovation or reform. His handling of ordinary administrative challenges, from Quidditch World Cup organization to routine magical creature management, demonstrated adequate technical skills while revealing troubling tendencies toward political calculation and personal advancement that would prove disastrous when circumstances demanded selfless dedication to public welfare over individual career considerations. The Sirius Black affair represented the first serious test of Fudge's leadership capabilities and revealed both his instinctive reliance on established procedures and his dangerous tendency to prioritize political appearances over factual accuracy and moral justice. The unprecedented escape from Azkaban prison created a genuine security crisis that required swift, decisive action based on careful analysis of available evidence. But Fudge's response was shaped more by bureaucratic convenience and public relations concerns than by serious investigation of the circumstances surrounding Black's imprisonment and escape. The Ministry's assumption that Black's escape represented a direct threat to Harry Potter reflected both legitimate security concerns and dangerous mythologizing of past events that prevented clear-headed analysis of current circumstances. The decision to deploy Dementors around Hogwarts School demonstrated both Fudge's willingness to employ extreme measures for public safety and his fundamental misunderstanding of the psychological and educational implications of domesticalimus. Exposing children to creatures that fed on human happiness and hope. The Dementor deployment controversy revealed the growing tension between security imperatives and civil liberties that would characterize much of Fudge's tenure, as his administration consistently chose measures that provided the appearance of decisive action while creating new problems and vulnerabilities that were often worse than the original threats they were meant to address. The psychological trauma inflicted on Hogwarts students by Dementor presence, culminating in Harry Potter's near-fatal encounter during a Quidditch match, demonstrated the human costs of security policies based on fear and political expediency rather than careful consideration of consequences and alternatives. The Triwizard Tournament's revival during Fudge's administration exemplified both his enthusiasm for high-profile international events that enhanced his political reputation and his inadequate attention to the security and safety considerations that such events required in an increasingly dangerous magical world. The tournament's organization reflected impressive logistical capabilities and international cooperation while revealing fundamental failures of intelligence assessment and threat analysis that would have catastrophic consequences for both individual participants and broader magical security. The selection of Harry Potter as a fourth champion through manipulation of the Goblet of Fire represented a security breach of extraordinary sophistication that should have triggered comprehensive investigation of all tournament personnel and procedures. But Fudge's response was characterized by denial, misdirection, and bureaucratic inertia that allowed the conspiracy to proceed toward its devastating conclusion. The Ministry's failure to recognize and respond to evidence of dark wizard infiltration reflected both specific intelligence failures and broader institutional blindness to threats that challenged comfortable assumptions about post-war security. The tragic death of Cedric Diggory during the tournament's final task marked the end of the peaceful era and the beginning of a new phase of magical conflict. Though Fudge's initial response was to treat the incident as an isolated tragedy rather than evidence of the systematic threat that careful analysis would have revealed. The eyewitness testimony provided by Harry Potter about Voldemort's return should have triggered immediate mobilization of all available Ministry resources for investigation and response, but instead prompted a campaign of denial and character assassination that would prove to be one of the most catastrophic policy failures in magical governmental history. The institutional psychology that drove the Ministry's denial of Voldemort's return reflected complex interactions between bureaucratic self-interest, political calculation, and genuine psychological inability to accept the return of threats that had been assumed to be permanently resolved. Fudge's personal investment in his reputation as the minister who had maintained post-war peace made it psychologically impossible for him to acknowledge evidence that challenged this central aspect of his political identity and historical legacy. The media manipulation campaign that accompanied the Ministry's denial strategy demonstrated both sophisticated understanding of public opinion management and moral bankruptcy in the willingness to destroy individual reputations and public trust in essential institutions for the sake of maintaining comfortable illusions. The systematic character assassination of Harry Potter and Albus Dumbledore through Daily Prophet articles reflected not just political desperation, but fundamental corruption of the relationship between governmental authority and public. Information that undermined democratic accountability and informed citizen participation in magical governance. The Daily Prophet's transformation from independent journalism to government propaganda organ revealed the fragility of press freedom and the ease with which financial pressure and political intimidation could corrupt media. Institutions that should have served as checks on governmental power. The newspaper's willingness to publish articles that its editors knew to be false or misleading reflected both economic dependence on ministry advertising and deeper cultural problems with the wizarding public's relationship to truth and factual accuracy. Dumbledore's opposition to ministry denial policies created a constitutional crisis that pitted the most respected figure in magical society against the official governmental apparatus, forcing magical citizens to choose between personal trust and institutional loyalty in ways that revealed deep divisions within magical society about the nature of authority and the sources of legitimate political power. The growing rift between Dumbledore and Fudge reflected not just personal disagreement but fundamental differences in understanding about leadership responsibilities and moral obligations that transcended normal political disputes. The ministry's campaign against Dumbledore included efforts to remove him from all official positions and honorary roles while questioning his mental competence and moral integrity in ways that revealed both the depth of Fudge's desperation and the dangerous precedent of using governmental power to attack private citizens whose only crime was disagreeing with official policy. The systematic effort to discredit Dumbledore's reputation and undermine his influence demonstrated authoritarian tendencies that should have alarmed anyone committed to democratic governance and civil liberties. Dolores Umbridge's appointment as Hogwarts High Inquisitor represented the culmination of the ministry's authoritarian drift and its most direct attack on educational independence and academic freedom. As her systematic dismantling of traditional educational practices reflected both personal sadism and broader governmental hostility toward institutions that maintained independence from direct political control. Her methods of discipline and surveillance created an atmosphere of fear and oppression that transformed Hogwarts from a center of learning and development into something approaching a totalitarian institution. The educational reforms implemented under Umbridge's authority reflected not just administrative preferences but ideological commitment to controlling information and limiting student access to knowledge that might challenge official policies or encourage independent thinking. The restriction of practical defense against the dark arts education left students vulnerable to precisely the threats that the ministry claimed did not exist, demonstrating the self-defeating nature of policies based on denial rather than factual assessment. The student resistance that emerged in response to Umbridge's oppression, culminating in the formation of Dumbledore's army, represented both admirable courage and tragic necessity as young people were forced to take responsibility for their own education and protection when official institutions failed to fulfill their basic obligations. The harsh punishment inflicted on students who participated in unauthorized educational activities revealed both Umbridge's personal cruelty and the broader moral bankruptcy of policies that criminalized learning and self-defense. The ministry's surveillance and security measures during this period created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that undermined the trust and cooperation essential for effective governance while failing to address the real security threats that continued to develop despite official denial. The expansion of ministry monitoring capabilities and the encouragement of citizen informants created precedents for authoritarian control that would be exploited by darker forces when they gained access to governmental power. The Department of Mystery's battle that finally exposed the truth about Voldemort's return represented both vindication for those who had insisted on factual accuracy and devastating condemnation of the political leadership that had wasted crucial time and resources on denial rather than preparation. The presence of Death Eaters within the Ministry building itself demonstrated the catastrophic intelligence failures that had resulted from prioritizing political convenience over security analysis and threat assessment. The public revelation of Voldemort's return through his appearance in the Ministry atrium created a crisis of confidence in governmental competence and honesty that went far beyond normal political disagreements to strike at the places. Foundations of institutional legitimacy and public trust. The undeniable evidence of official deception and incompetence created conditions that would make effective response to future threats far more difficult by undermining the authority and credibility necessary for public cooperation with emergency measures. Administrative chaos in the aftermath of public revelation reflected both the practical consequences of failed policies and the psychological impact of institutional collapse on Ministry employees who had believed in the competence and integrity of their leadership. The rapid succession of policy reversals, personnel changes, and emergency measures created confusion and demoralization that hindered effective response to the crisis, while providing opportunities for hostile forces to exploit governmental weakness. The parliamentary inquiry and public criticism that accompanied Fudge's downfall demonstrated both the continued vitality of democratic accountability mechanisms within magical government and the terrible costs of leadership failure. During critical periods when effective governance could mean the difference between survival and destruction. The investigative reports that documented the scope of administrative failure and willful blindness provided valuable lessons for future leaders, while confirming the worst fears of those who had warned about the dangers of political self-deception. Fudge's resignation and departure from office represented not just personal failure, but institutional crisis that raised fundamental questions about the adequacy of magical governmental structures and selection processes for dealing with existential threats that required exceptional leadership and moral courage. His replacement by Rufus Scrimgeour reflected recognition of the need for more aggressive leadership, while revealing the limited pool of qualified candidates and the difficulty of repairing institutional damage once public trust had been shattered. The historical assessment of Fudge's tenure as one of the most disastrous in Ministry history reflected both the objective consequences of his failed policies and the broader lessons about the importance of intellectual honesty, moral courage, and institutional accountability in democratic governance. His legacy served as a permanent reminder of the dangers of political self-deception and the catastrophic costs that could result when leaders prioritized personal reputation over public welfare and factual accuracy. The international reputation damage inflicted by the Ministry's denial and incompetence affected not just bilateral magical relationships, but broader questions of British leadership within the global magical community. As foreign magical governments lost confidence in British competence and reliability, while questioning whether cooperation with such unreliable partners was worth the risks and costs involved. The restoration of international trust would require not just policy changes, but fundamental reforms in governmental culture and decision-making processes that could prevent similar failures in the future. The domestic political consequences of the Fudge era included not just immediate policy changes, but longer-term erosion of public faith in governmental institutions and expert authority that would influence magical politics for decades. The revelation that respected officials and established institutions could be so fundamentally wrong about matters of existential importance created cynicism and skepticism that would make future governance more difficult while potentially undermining appropriate responses to legitimate threats and emergencies. The social divisions that emerged during the denial period reflected deeper cultural and ideological conflicts within magical society about the nature of truth, the sources of authority, and the obligations of citizenship that transcended immediate political disagreements to reveal fundamental tensions about magical identity and values. The polarization between those who accepted official denials and those who insisted on independent judgment created lasting resentments and suspicions that would influence magical politics and social relationships long after the immediate crisis had passed. The economic costs of the denial period included not just direct expenditures on failed policies and wasted resources, but broader damage to magical commercial confidence and international economic relationships that reduced prosperity and opportunity throughout magical society. The uncertainty and instability created by governmental incompetence discouraged investment and innovation while encouraging capital flight and emigration among those magical families who had the resources to relocate to more stable environments. The psychological trauma inflicted on magical society by the combination of renewed terrorist threats and governmental failure created lasting damage to social cohesion and civic engagement that would require years of careful reconstruction to repair. The recognition that established institutions could fail so catastrophically, while trusted leaders could prove so inadequate, created anxiety and disillusionment that undermined the social trust necessary for democratic governance and cooperative problem-solving. The educational impact of the Fudge era included not just the immediate damage to student learning and development, but broader questions about the relationship between academic independence and governmental authority that would influence party of spati educational policy for generations. The precedent of direct political interference in educational content and methods created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by future administrations while undermining the professional autonomy necessary for effective teaching and learning. The legal and constitutional implications of the ministry's authoritarian measures during this period established dangerous precedents for governmental overreach and abuse of civil liberties that would need to be carefully addressed. Through reform legislation and institutional changes designed to prevent similar abuses in the future, the concentration of emergency powers in executive authorities without adequate legislative oversight or judicial review created vulnerabilities that threatened the balance of powers essential for democratic governance. As the Fudge era drew to its ignominious close and magical Britain prepared to confront the renewed threat of Voldemort's terrorism under new leadership, the costs of denial and institutional failure were becoming tragically apparent in every aspect of magical society. The wasted years during which effective preparation and response could have been implemented had provided dark forces with crucial time and opportunity to rebuild their strength while undermining the governmental institutions and social cohesion necessary for effective resistance. The legacy of this period would serve as a permanent warning about the dangers of political self-deception and the catastrophic consequences that could result when leaders chose comfortable lies over difficult truths, personal advancement over public service, and political expediency over moral courage. The institutional reforms and cultural changes necessary to prevent similar failures would require sustained effort and commitment from future generations of magical leaders and citizens who understood that democratic governance demanded not just formal structures but active engagement and moral accountability from all participants in the political process. The foundations had been shaken but not destroyed, and the possibility remained for reconstruction and reform that could create more resilient and responsive institutions capable of meeting future challenges while preserving the democratic values and civil liberties that made magical civilization worth defending against whatever threats might emerge from the darkness that always lurked at the edges of civilized society. The summer of 1996 descended upon magical Britain like a storm cloud heavy with the promise of violence and upheaval. As the undeniable return of Lord Voldemort shattered the comfortable illusions that had sustained magical society through a decade of willful blindness and institutional failure. The Ministry of Magic that now faced this resurgent threat bore little resemblance to the confident and competent institution that had emerged victorious from previous conflicts. Its credibility shattered by years of denial, and its operational capabilities weakened by political infighting and administrative incompetence that had left magical Britain dangerously unprepared for the warfare that was about to engulf every corner of wizarding civilization. Rufus Scrimgeour's appointment as Minister of Magic represented both recognition of the need for more aggressive leadership and acknowledgement of the limited options available to a magical government that had squandered crucial years of preparation time through cowardice and self-deception. His background as head of the Auror office provided him with practical understanding of magical law enforcement and counter-terrorism operations. But his elevation to the highest political office also revealed the extent to which normal governmental succession had been disrupted by the crisis of confidence that accompanied Fudge's spectacular failure. The wartime ministry that Scrimgeour inherited was an institution in crisis. Its departments demoralized by years of political manipulation, and its personnel uncertain about their duties and loyalties after witnessing the catastrophic consequences of following orders from leaders who had prioritized political expedience over factual accuracy and moral courage. The restoration of institutional competence and public confidence would require not just policy changes, but fundamental cultural transformation that acknowledged past failures while rebuilding the trust and cooperation essential for effective governance under conditions of existential threat. Scrimgeour's early policies reflected both genuine commitment to confronting the Death Eater threat and dangerous tendencies toward authoritarian control that risked repeating the mistakes of previous administrations in different forms, as his emphasis on security measures and emergency powers created new opportunities for governmental overreach, while potentially alienating the very citizens whose support was essential for successful resistance to Voldemort's terrorism. The balance between necessary security improvements and preservation of democratic values would prove to be one of the most challenging aspects of wartime governance. The Death Eater infiltration of the ministry represented the culmination of a sophisticated long-term strategy that had exploited both the institutional weaknesses revealed during the Fudge era and the specific vulnerabilities created by years of denial and inadequate security measures. The systematic placement of Voldemort's agents within key governmental positions had provided dark forces with intelligence, influence, and operational capabilities that made the ministry's own resources into weapons that could be used against magical society itself. The speed and effectiveness of the Death Eater takeover demonstrated both the thoroughness of Voldemort's planning and the fragility of democratic institutions when confronted by enemies who understood their weaknesses better than their defenders did, as years of careful infiltration and systematic corruption came to fruition in a coordinated assault that transformed the ministry from protector into oppressor in a matter of hours. The psychological impact of this transformation was devastating for magical society, as citizens who had grown accustomed to viewing governmental authority as legitimate and benevolent suddenly found themselves subject to systematic persecution by their own institutions. Pius Thickness's installation as puppet minister represented both symbolic victory for Death Eater ideology and practical demonstration of the Imperious Curse's political utility, as his apparent legitimacy provided cover for policies and actions that would have been immediately recognized as illegitimate if imposed through obvious coercion. The use of magical mind control to create the appearance of democratic governance while implementing totalitarian policies revealed the sophistication of Voldemort's understanding of political psychology and institutional manipulation. The Muggle-born Registration Commission established under the puppet regime represented the systematic implementation of pure-blood supremacist ideology through bureaucratic mechanisms that gave the appearance of legal procedure, while facilitating systematic persecution and eventual genocide of magical citizens whose only crime was their ancestry. The Commission's operation demonstrated how administrative efficiency could be perverted to serve evil purposes, and how normal governmental procedures could be manipulated to legitimize the illegitimate. The psychological impact of systematic persecution on Muggle-born magical citizens and their families created trauma that extended far beyond immediate physical threats to include the destruction of identity, community, and trust that had sustained magical society through previous challenges, as individuals who had considered themselves full members of the wizarding community suddenly found themselves classified as subhuman and targeted for elimination. The social fragmentation that resulted from these policies undermined the unity and cooperation essential for effective resistance, while serving the Death Eater goal of dividing and weakening potential opposition. The resistance networks that emerged within the compromised ministry represented both individual courage and institutional resilience. As ministry employees who retained loyalty to democratic values and human dignity risked their lives and careers to protect targeted citizens while gathering intelligence that would prove crucial for eventual liberation efforts. The existence of internal resistance demonstrated that totalitarian control could never be complete as long as individuals retained moral consciousness and the courage to act upon their convictions. Arthur Weasley's leadership of resistance efforts within the ministry exemplified the quiet heroism of ordinary governmental employees who chose principle over personal safety while using their knowledge of institutional procedures and bureaucratic systems to frustrate Death Eater policies and protect vulnerable citizens. His ability to maintain operational security while coordinating with external resistance forces demonstrated both professional competence and moral courage that contrasted sharply with the collaboration and cowardice that characterized many of his colleagues' responses to totalitarian pressure. The underground support networks that sustained resistance activities included not just organized political opposition but spontaneous acts of decency and mutual aid that preserved human dignity and social solidarity under conditions designed to destroy both, as magical citizens discovered reserves of courage and compassion that enabled them to maintain moral identity even when official institutions had been corrupted beyond recognition. These informal networks proved to be more resilient and effective than formal organizational structures in maintaining resistance capabilities under totalitarian surveillance and repression. The propaganda campaigns that accompanied Death Eater control of official media demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mass psychology and political communication, as systematic lies and distortions were used to justify persecution while creating confusion and demoralization that hindered organized resistance efforts. The transformation of the Daily Prophet from independent journalism to totalitarian propaganda revealed both the vulnerability of media institutions to political pressure and the crucial importance of information control for maintaining illegitimate authority. The economic warfare that accompanied political oppression included systematic seizure of property, exclusion from employment, and manipulation of magical commerce to reward collaboration while punishing resistance, creating material incentives for cooperation with Death Eater policies while undermining the economic foundations of opposition activities. The use of economic pressure as a weapon of political control demonstrated the interconnection between political freedom and economic independence, while revealing how totalitarian systems sought to control every aspect of human existence. Educational policies under Death Eater control included systematic indoctrination of young magical citizens through curriculum changes that promoted pure-blood supremacist ideology while eliminating critical thinking and independent inquiry that might challenge official orthodoxy, as Hogwarts and other magical schools were transformed from centers of learning into institutions of political control and cultural manipulation. The corruption of education represented perhaps the most insidious aspect of totalitarian rule, as it sought to shape future generations according to extremist ideology, while destroying the intellectual foundations of democratic citizenship. The resistance at Hogwarts, led by Neville Longbottom and other student leaders, demonstrated both the failure of totalitarian educational control and the resilience of values and principles that could survive even systematic attempts at indoctrination. As young people who had been raised in democratic magical society retained moral consciousness and courage that enabled them to resist official pressure while maintaining underground networks of mutual support and opposition activity. International magical responses to the Death Eater takeover varied significantly based on national interests, cultural values, and practical capabilities for intervention. As some foreign magical governments provided sanctuary and support for British magical refugees, while others maintained official neutrality or even collaboration with Voldemort's regime. The limited nature of international assistance revealed both the constraints of magical diplomacy and the ultimate responsibility of individual magical communities for their own liberation and democratic governance. The Battle of Hogwarts represented the culmination of years of resistance efforts and the final test of whether democratic values and human dignity could survive systematic assault from totalitarian ideology backed by overwhelming magical power, as the combined forces of official resistance, underground networks, and spontaneous popular uprising converged in defense of institutions and principles that had been under attack since Voldemort's return to power. The physical destruction that accompanied the final battle was extensive but ultimately less significant than the moral and political victory achieved through successful resistance to totalitarian rule. As the defeat of Voldemort and his forces vindicated the principles of democratic governance and human equality, while demonstrating that even the most sophisticated forms of magical oppression could not permanently suppress the human desire for freedom and dignity. Kingsley Shacklebolt's appointment as emergency minister reflected both practical necessity and symbolic commitment to rebuilding democratic institutions based on competence, integrity, and dedication to public service, rather than political calculation or personal advancement. His background in Auror service and resistance activities provided him with both practical experience in magical law enforcement and moral credibility that would prove essential for the challenging work of post-war reconstruction and institutional reform. The immediate challenges that faced the post-war ministry included not just physical reconstruction and administrative reorganization, but fundamental questions about accountability, justice, and reconciliation that would determine whether magical Britain could learn from its experiences and build more resilient democratic institutions capable of preventing similar failures in the future. The balance between punishment for collaboration and forgiveness for those who had been coerced or misled would require wisdom and judgment that went beyond normal political and legal categories. Post-war trials of Death Eaters and collaborators represented both legal necessity and moral imperative. As magical society sought to establish accountability for crimes committed during the totalitarian period while distinguishing between different levels of responsibility and culpability that reflected the complex circumstances under which individuals had made choices between resistance and collaboration. The trials provided opportunities for truth-telling and acknowledgement that were essential for social healing while establishing precedents that could deter future political extremism and violence. The use of veritaserum and other magical investigative techniques in post-war justice proceedings raised important questions about civil liberties and due process that required careful balance between the need for accurate fact-finding and the protection of individual rights that had been so brutally violated during the Death Eater regime. The decisions made about acceptable investigative methods would influence magical legal culture for generations while demonstrating the commitment of reformed institutions to operating according to democratic principles rather than expedient pragmatism. Institutional reforms implemented during the Reconstruction period addressed both specific vulnerabilities that had been exploited by Death Eater infiltration and broader structural problems that had made the ministry susceptible to political manipulation and authoritarian control, as new procedures for personnel security, information protection, and decision-making accountability were designed to prevent similar institutional failures while preserving the flexibility and responsiveness necessary for effective democratic governance. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures was fundamentally reorganized under Hermione Granger's leadership to reflect principles of equality and mutual respect rather than domination and exploitation. As centuries of discriminatory policies were systematically dismantled and replaced with frameworks for cooperation and partnership that acknowledged the intelligence, dignity, and rights of non-human magical beings who had suffered under pure-blood supremacist ideology. House self-liberation efforts represented one of the most significant and challenging aspects of post-war social reform, as the systematic exploitation of house elf labor had become so integral to magical domestic and economic arrangements that its elimination required fundamental changes in lifestyle and social organization that many magical families found difficult to accept. The gradual transformation of house elf relationships from slavery to employment reflected both moral progress and practical adaptation to new social and legal realities. Werewolf rights legislation addressed decades of discrimination and marginalization that had pushed many werewolves toward collaboration with Death Eater forces through desperation and resentment, as new policies provided employment opportunities, medical support, and legal protections that acknowledged werewolf humanity while addressing legitimate public safety concerns through means other than systematic persecution and exclusion. The international rehabilitation efforts required to restore magical Britain's reputation and relationships after years of Death Eater control involved extensive diplomatic activity and practical cooperation that demonstrated commitment to democratic values and international law, while acknowledging responsibility for the damage that had been caused by inadequate resistance to totalitarian takeover. The restoration of international confidence would require consistent demonstration of reformed behavior rather than simply rhetorical commitments to democratic principles. Economic reconstruction programs addressed both immediate needs for physical rebuilding and longer-term requirements for restoring commercial confidence and international trade relationships that had been disrupted by years of political instability and authoritarian control. As magical businesses and financial institutions work to re-establish normal operations while adapting to new social and legal frameworks that reflected reformed values and priorities. The cultural healing processes that accompanied institutional reconstruction included efforts to commemorate victims of Death Eater persecution while celebrating heroes of resistance activities. As magical society sought to preserve memory of both suffering and courage that could guide future responses to political extremism and violence. The establishment of memorial sites and educational programs served both therapeutic and preventive functions, while acknowledging the complexity of moral choices that individuals had faced under totalitarian pressure. Educational reform efforts focused on restoring academic independence and critical thinking capabilities while incorporating lessons learned about the dangers of political extremism and the importance of civic engagement for maintaining democratic institutions. as Hogwarts and other magical schools developed new curricula that combined traditional magical knowledge with enhanced understanding of political responsibility and moral decision-making. The teacher training and curriculum development programs that supported educational reform reflected recognition that democratic citizenship required not just technical knowledge, but moral education and critical thinking skills that could enable future generations to resist political manipulation while maintaining commitment to human dignity and mutual respect, regardless of ancestry or social position. Media reform initiatives addressed the propaganda role that magical journalism had played in both enabling Death Eater takeover and facilitating resistance activities. As new standards for professional ethics and factual accuracy were developed to ensure that magical news media could serve its essential function of informing public discourse without becoming a tool for political manipulation or systematic deception. The legal and constitutional reforms that emerged from post-war reconstruction efforts established new frameworks for governmental accountability and civil liberties, protection that were designed to prevent future authoritarian takeovers while preserving the executive authority necessary for effective governance during legitimate emergencies. As magical constitutional law evolved to reflect lessons learned about the vulnerability of democratic institutions to systematic assault from within and without, civil service reform programs addressed the personnel and procedural weaknesses that had enabled Death Eater infiltration while creating new systems for recruitment, training, and accountability that emphasized professional competence and ethical integrity rather than political loyalty or family connections. As the ministry developed human resource practices that could attract and retain qualified employees while maintaining security standards appropriate for governmental service, the social reconciliation efforts that accompanied institutional reform addressed the deep divisions and resentments that had been created or exacerbated during years of political conflict and totalitarian control. As magical communities worked to rebuild trust and cooperation that had been damaged by collaboration, resistance, and mutual suspicion during the darkest period in modern magical history, community healing programs provided support for individuals and families who had suffered trauma during the Death Eater period while creating opportunities for acknowledgement and forgiveness that could enable former opponents to participate constructively in democratic society, as magical Britain sought to balance accountability for past wrongs with practical necessity for future cooperation and social solidarity. The generational transition that occurred during the Reconstruction period brought new leadership and fresh perspectives to magical government while honoring the experience and sacrifice of older generations who had maintained democratic values through periods of crisis and upheaval. As young magical citizens who had grown up during the conflict took responsibility for building the kind of society that could prevent similar tragedies while preserving the freedom and dignity that made such efforts worthwhile. As the Reconstruction period gave way to a new era of democratic governance based on hard-won wisdom and institutional reform, magical Britain had been transformed by its encounter with totalitarian evil and its successful resistance to systematic oppression. The ministry that emerged from this trial was both more humble and more confident than previous versions, understanding its limitations while committed to the democratic principles and human values that justified its existence and guided its activities. The foundations had been rebuilt on firmer ground, but the ultimate test of their strength would come with future challenges that would require all the wisdom and capability that wartime experience and post-war reform had developed while demanding continued vigilance and moral courage from all participants in the democratic process. The victory over Voldemort had preserved magical civilization, but the work of building a more just and resilient magical society remained an ongoing responsibility that each generation would need to embrace and fulfill according to its own circumstances and capabilities. The dawn of the 21st century cast its golden light across a magical Britain that had been forged in the crucible of war and tempered by the difficult work of reconstruction. As the wizarding world entered a new millennium bearing both the scars of its encounters with darkness and the wisdom that came from having faced the worst impulses of magical civilization and emerged victorious through courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to the principles that made magical society worth defending. The Ministry of Magic that governed this transformed magical community represented the culmination of centuries of governmental evolution, incorporating lessons learned through trial and error, triumph and defeat, into institutional structures that reflected both democratic ideals and practical understanding of the challenges inherent in governing a hidden society with unique capabilities and responsibilities. The permanent reforms that had emerged from the traumatic experiences of the Second Wizarding War went far beyond simple policy adjustments to encompass fundamental changes in governmental culture, administrative procedures, and the relationship between magical institutions and the citizens they served. As recognition of past failures had created both opportunity and imperative for comprehensive transformation that could prevent similar catastrophes while preserving the flexibility and responsiveness necessary for effective governance in an uncertain and evolving world. Kingsley Shacklebolt's transition from emergency minister to elected head of government reflected both institutional continuity and democratic renewal, as his leadership during the Reconstruction period had demonstrated the competence and integrity that magical citizens demanded from their political leaders, while his commitment to reform and accountability provided assurance that the new governmental structures would be maintained and strengthened rather than gradually eroded by political convenience or bureaucratic inertia. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures underwent the most dramatic transformation of any ministry division. As Hermione Granger's leadership brought both intellectual rigor and moral passion to the systematic dismantling of discriminatory policies that had characterized magical creature relations for over 3 centuries. The department's new mission of cooperation and partnership rather than regulation and control reflected fundamental changes in magical society's understanding of citizenship, rights, and the obligations that came with magical power and privilege. House elf liberation initiatives represented perhaps the most challenging aspect of creature rights reform, as the systematic exploitation of house elf labor had become so integral to magical domestic arrangements that its elimination required not just legal changes, but cultural transformation that challenged basic assumptions about magical lifestyle and social organization that many wizarding families found difficult to accept. The gradual transition from slavery to employment relationships required extensive education and support programs that helped both house elves and their former masters adapt to new patterns of interaction based on mutual respect and base of fair compensation. The establishment of house elf educational programs and career development services reflected recognition that centuries of systematic oppression had denied house elves opportunities to develop their capabilities and pursue their Bela Festales and Bela interests beyond domestic service, as newly liberated magical beings discovered talents and ambitions that had been suppressed by generations of conditioning and institutional constraint. The success of these programs in producing house elf professionals in fields ranging from magical lore to experimental magic demonstrated both the injustice of previous policies and the potential benefits of inclusive approaches to magical education and career development. Werewolf integration efforts built upon Remus Lupin's pioneering work to create comprehensive support systems that addressed both the practical challenges of living with lycanthropy and the social discrimination that had marginalized werewolf communities for generations, as new medical treatments, employment opportunities, and legal protections transformed werewolf experience from isolated suffering to community membership with appropriate accommodations for their unique circumstances and needs. The werewolf registry was completely reformed to emphasize support services rather than surveillance and control, as registration became voluntary and confidential while providing access to specialized medical care, employment counseling, and social services that helped werewolves maintain productive lives and meaningful relationships within magical society. The success of these programs in reducing werewolf-related incidents, while improving quality of life, demonstrated the effectiveness of inclusion and support over segregation and punishment. Giant rehabilitation programs addressed one of the most complex and challenging aspects of magical creature relations, as the near extinction of giant communities and their historical association with violence and destruction required careful approaches that acknowledged legitimate safety concerns while recognizing giant intelligence and potential for peaceful coexistence. The establishment of giant settlements in remote but not isolated areas provided opportunities for cultural preservation and development, while creating frameworks for interaction with wizarding society that emphasized mutual respect and benefit. Centaur relations evolved toward genuine partnership and consultation, as the ministry's new approach to magical creature policy recognized centaur wisdom and knowledge as valuable contributions to governmental decision-making, rather than simply obstacles to be managed or ignored. The inclusion of centaur representatives in environmental and divination policy discussions demonstrated both respect for centaur expertise and practical recognition that effective governance required input from all segments of magical 12C's society. International magical cooperation reached unprecedented levels of sophistication and effectiveness during this period, as the shared experience of confronting Voldemort's threat had created new forms of collaboration and mutual understanding that transcended traditional national boundaries and cultural differences. The British ministry's role in developing enhanced international frameworks reflected both its hard-won expertise in counter-terrorism and reconstruction, and its commitment to preventing similar threats from emerging elsewhere in the magical world. The International Confederation of Wizards underwent significant organizational changes that strengthened its capacity for coordinated responses to transnational threats while respecting national sovereignty and cultural diversity. As member nations developed new mechanisms for information sharing, joint operations, and mutual assistance that balanced collective security needs with individual governmental autonomy. The British ministry's contributions to these reforms reflected its understanding that magical security was ultimately global rather than national in scope. Magical cultural exchange programs expanded significantly during this period, as recognition of the benefits of diversity and cross-cultural learning led to increased educational and professional exchanges that enriched magical society, while building international relationships that could prevent conflicts and misunderstandings that might otherwise escalate into violence. These programs demonstrated both the vitality of magical culture and its capacity for growth and adaptation through contact with different traditions and perspectives. Technological integration challenges emerged as the Muggle world's rapid advancement in communication, transportation, and information processing created new requirements for statute of secrecy maintenance while offering potential benefits for magical society that could be adapted for magical use. The ministry's approach to Muggle technology reflected careful balance between maintaining necessary separation and learning from innovations that could enhance magical capabilities without compromising fundamental principles or security requirements. The development of magical adaptations of Muggle communication technologies created new possibilities for international cooperation and emergency response while requiring sophisticated concealment and security measures that could prevent detection or infiltration by non-magical authorities. The success of these innovations in improving governmental effectiveness while maintaining secrecy demonstrated the continued viability of the statute system when properly supported by adequate resources and expertise. Environmental magical conservation emerged as a major governmental priority as climate change and environmental degradation in the Muggle world created challenges that affected magical ecosystems and creature habitats regardless of concealment measures, requiring new forms of cooperation between magical and non-magical conservation efforts while maintaining statute secrecy through carefully designed intervention programs. The Department for Environmental Magical Protection was established to coordinate conservation efforts and address environmental threats that could affect both magical and non-magical ecosystems. As recognition grew that magical societies' long-term sustainability required active engagement with environmental challenges that transcended the traditional boundaries between hidden and open societies. The department's work in protecting magical creature habitats and preserving magical plant species demonstrated both environmental stewardship and practical recognition of magical societies' dependence on healthy, natural systems. Magical weather management programs addressed the growing complexity of maintaining natural weather patterns while concealing magical interventions from increasingly sophisticated Muggle meteorological monitoring systems. As traditional weather magic had to be adapted for a world where atmospheric conditions were continuously observed and analyzed through technological means that could potentially detect magical influences. Youth integration initiatives recognized that magical society's future depended on successfully preparing young wizards and witches for leadership roles, while ensuring that they understood both the achievements and failures of previous generations. As educational programs and career development services were designed to channel youthful energy and idealism toward constructive purposes while avoiding the extremism and division that had characterized earlier periods of magical history. The expansion of magical educational opportunities beyond traditional Hogwarts education created new pathways for career development and personal growth that reflected the increasing complexity and specialization of magical society. As professional schools, technical institutes, and continuing education programs provided training in fields that had not existed during earlier periods of magical development. Student exchange programs between magical schools in different countries expanded significantly during this period, creating opportunities for young wizards and witches to experience different magical cultures while building international relationships that could support future cooperation and understanding. These programs demonstrated both the universality of magical experience and the richness of cultural diversity within the global magical community. Educational partnerships between the ministry and magical schools created new opportunities for practical learning and career preparation, while ensuring that academic independence was preserved and that educational content reflected both professional requirements and broader cultural values that supported democratic citizenship and social responsibility. Civic engagement programs encouraged magical citizens to participate actively in governmental processes and community development, while providing the knowledge and skills necessary for informed participation in democratic decision-making. As recognition grew that effective governance required not just competent leadership, but engaged citizenship that could hold officials accountable while supporting necessary policies and reforms. Volunteer service initiatives created opportunities for magical citizens to contribute to community welfare and social improvement while developing skills and relationships that strengthened social cohesion and mutual support. As the ministry recognized that governmental services alone could not address all social needs and that voluntary associations and individual initiative remained essential components of a healthy democratic society. Public transparency initiatives addressed the secrecy and lack of accountability that had contributed to past governmental failures by creating new mechanisms for citizen access to information and participation in policy development while maintaining necessary security protections and operational confidentiality that effective governance required. The Magical Freedom of Information system established procedures for citizen access to governmental documents and decision-making processes while protecting sensitive information related to security operations and individual privacy, as the ministry sought to balance democratic accountability with practical operational requirements in ways that served both governmental effectiveness and citizen rights. Citizen advisory committees and public consultation processes created formal mechanisms for public input on policy development and implementation, while ensuring that diverse perspectives and interests were represented in governmental policy decision-making, as recognition grew that complex policy challenges required input from affected communities and stakeholders who possessed knowledge and insights that governmental experts might lack. Future challenges identification and preparation efforts reflected recognition that magical society would continue to face new threats and opportunities that would require adaptive responses and innovative solutions. As the ministry developed strategic planning capabilities and early warning systems that could identify emerging challenges while maintaining the flexibility and responsiveness necessary for effective governance in an uncertain world. Emerging magical research initiatives addressed fundamental questions about the nature of magic and its potential applications, while ensuring that new discoveries were developed and deployed in ways that served beneficial purposes rather than destructive ones, as the ministry sought to encourage innovation while preventing the kind of magical experimentation that could threaten public safety or magical security. Magical artificial intelligence research represented one of the most promising and potentially dangerous areas of magical innovation, as the development of magical consciousness and autonomous magical systems offered tremendous potential benefits while raising fundamental questions about consciousness, rights, and control that would require careful consideration and regulation to ensure that these technologies served human welfare rather than replacing or threatening it. Cross-dimensional magical research addressed theoretical and practical questions about the nature of magical reality and the possibility of contact with other forms of magical consciousness, as advances in theoretical magic opened new possibilities for understanding and exploration, while requiring careful safety measures and ethical guidelines that could prevent dangerous experimentation or uncontrolled contact with unknown forces. The ministry of the present day represented the culmination of centuries of institutional evolution and the foundation for future development that would be shaped by the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. As magical government had matured into a sophisticated and responsive institution that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its core commitment to democratic values and public service. Departmental reorganization reflected both lessons learned from past experiences and practical requirements for addressing contemporary challenges, as the ministry's structure evolved to emphasize coordination and cooperation while maintaining specialized expertise and clear accountability that effective administration required. The integration of new departments and the modification of existing ones demonstrated institutional flexibility while preserving essential functions and capabilities. Personnel policies emphasized merit-based recruitment and advancement while ensuring diversity and inclusion that reflected the full spectrum of magical society, as the ministry sought to attract and retain the most capable employees regardless of their background while building institutional culture that valued competence, integrity, and public service over political connections or social status. Professional development programs provided ongoing education and career advancement opportunities for ministry employees while ensuring that governmental service remained attractive to talented individuals who might otherwise pursue Private sector careers, as recognition grew that effective governance required not just initial competence, but continuous learning and adaptation to changing circumstances and requirements. Interdepartmental cooperation mechanisms addressed the coordination challenges that had hindered governmental effectiveness in previous eras, while maintaining departmental autonomy and expertise that specialized functions required, as new procedures and technologies facilitated information sharing and joint operations while preserving clear lines of authority and accountability. International relationship management reflected the ministry's enhanced role in global magical affairs, while ensuring that international commitments did not compromise national sovereignty or democratic accountability. As British magical diplomacy balanced leadership responsibilities with respect for other magical nations' autonomy and cultural distinctiveness, the ongoing evolution of magical governance continued to reflect both changing circumstances and unchanging principles. As each generation of magical leaders and citizens faced the challenge of adapting inherited institutions to contemporary needs while preserving the values and capabilities that made democratic magical society worth defending and, quote, developing. Current challenges included managing the increasing complexity of magical society while maintaining the coherence and effectiveness that good governance required. As specialization and diversity created both opportunities and potential sources of fragmentation that required careful balance and coordination to prevent dysfunction or conflict. The relationship between magical and non-magical societies remained a fundamental challenge that required constant attention and adaptation. As changes in both communities created new requirements for statute maintenance while offering potential opportunities for beneficial interaction that could serve both magical and non-magical welfare if properly managed and carefully implemented. As the ministry entered its 4th century of existence, it carried forward both the wisdom gained through centuries of experience and the recognition that each generation would face unique challenges that would require fresh thinking and innovative solutions while honoring the principles and achievements that had made magical civilization possible and worthwhile. The continuing story of magical governance would be written by future generations who would inherit both achievements and responsibilities from their predecessors, while facing circumstances that could not be fully anticipated or prepared. For except through the cultivation of character, competence, and commitment to the democratic values and human dignity that made effective governance both possible and meaningful. And so we reach the end of our journey through the vast corridors of magical governance, from ancient councils to modern ministries, witnessing the endless dance of power and principle that has shaped wizarding civilization for over a millennium. The Ministry of Magic stands today as testament to the evolution of magical society, bearing the scars of conflicts overcome and the wisdom of lessons learned through centuries of triumph and failure, adaptation and growth. Each minister who walked these halls, each department that served magical Britain, each policy decision that balanced competing interests, contributed threads to the complex tapestry of magical government that protects and serves the wizarding world. From the Wizards' Council's informal gatherings to the sophisticated bureaucracy of the modern era, from the crisis of Grindelwald's rise to the reconstruction following Voldemort's defeat, the story of magical governance reveals both human frailty and institutional resilience that have preserved democratic values through the darkest challenges. As you drift toward dreams, remember that somewhere in London's depths, the Ministry of Magic continues its eternal vigil, its officials working through the night to maintain the delicate balance between magical and muggle worlds. The legacy of centuries past guides present decisions while future generations prepare to inherit both achievements and responsibilities that will shape magical civilization for centuries yet to come. Sleep well, knowing that the foundations laid by those who came before provide security for peaceful slumber in a world where magic and democracy have learned to flourish together.